Heiberg imagines a reader who, after having finished part one, loses patience and closes the book with the words, "Enough, I've had enough of either and I'll have no or." Kirkegaard was deeply offended by this and could never forgive Heiberg. He responded to it with an article in the journal The Fatherland, dated March the 5th, 1843, still under the pseudonym Victor Eremita. The article is entitled, "A Word of Thanks to Professor Heiberg." Kirkegaard, in a sense, takes the same approach as Socrates does with his interlocutors. He begins by acknowledging Heiberg's great expertise in literary affairs, just as Socrates begins by acknowledging that the other person is an expert in whatever it is he claims to know something about. Kirkegaard then goes on to mock satirically different passages from Heiberg's review. Heiberg casts his review in terms of the experience of an imaginary reader whom he refers to with the impersonal pronoun one. Kirkegaard humorously seizes on this and constantly refers to one's view of the work. At the end, Kirkegaard exuberantly thanks Heiberg for his insightful review. He does so with such enthusiasm that there can be no doubt about the sarcasm. He has Victor Eremita write, quote, "For all this, I thank you, Professor. I rejoice that learning is so swiftly imitated. I thank you for wanting to communicate it so quickly. If I were to choose the person in literature whom I would thank first of all, I would choose you, Professor." This profuse expression of gratitude can be seen to mirror Socrates' more reserved sarcasm when he claims, for example, to want to learn from Euthyphro and to want to become his student. The natural reaction of most writers who suffer a negative book review is to react by trying to point out things that the book does well and thus trying to refute the criticisms that have been raised against it. But Kirkegaard doesn't try to defend the merits of his work in any positive way. Instead, his approach is negative, just like that of Socrates. He seems on the face of it to grant the truth of Heiberg's claims and then indirectly to undermine them. With Either Or, Kirkegaard began a remarkably productive period of writing. He lived here in this building in a street called Norragade during this time, specifically from April 1840 until October 1844. This was where he lived both before and after his trip to Berlin. Only 8 months after the publication of Either Or, 3 new books appeared on the same day, October the 16th, 1843. These works were Repetition, written by the pseudonymous author Constantine Constantius, Fear and Trembling by Johannes de Silentio, and 3 edifying discourses in Kierkegaard's own name. With regard to 3 edifying discourses, this is one of a series of collections of edifying or upbuilding works that Kierkegaard published between 1843 and 1844. In each of these years, he published individual collections of 2, 3, and 4 edifying discourses, respectively. These were then later collected by Kierkegaard's publisher and published under the title of 18 Edifying or Upbuilding Discourses. These texts are generally regarded as some of the key works of Kierkegaard as a Christian author. They're all signed in Kierkegaard's name and are not attributed to pseudonymous authors. They're moreover intended to be more popular works than the pseudonymous writings. They address the common religious believer without any sophisticated or complex argumentation. There's no direct reference, for example, to Greek or German philosophers by name, although Socrates is referred to as the wise man of old. Kierkegaard returned to Berlin for a short stay in May of 1843, and this provided him with the inspiration for the short book Repetition. This novella is the story of a young man who asks the question of whether or not a repetition is possible. Like Kierkegaard, the young man had been in Berlin once before, and so he hits upon the idea of making a return trip to see if he can repeat his experience. He thus goes back to the Prussian capital and tries to visit the old places that he went to during his first visit. But he finds that many things have changed in the interim, and it's impossible to recreate his original experience of the city. Not only has the city itself changed, but he has changed, and so the way in which he experiences the city is also different. His conclusion from this experiment is that no true repetition is really possible since things are always changing. Given this, One might think that the concept of repetition isn't a very important one for Kirkegaard, but in fact, this isn't the case. Indeed, it's quite an important idea for him. He speaks of repetition in the sense of appropriation. There are, for example, a number of abstract ethical principles or rules that the individual must appropriate in terms of his or her particular situation. When one appropriates these rules in a concrete action, one is in a sense repeating the original rule. If there were no element of repetition here, then one couldn't be said to be following the rule. In this sense, Kirkegaard explores the concept in the context of ethics. The third work that appeared on the same day, Fear and Trembling, is one of Kirkegaard's best-known works. In this work, he takes as a central motif the story from the Old Testament about God's command to Abraham that he sacrifice his son Isaac. The work is divided into 3 chapters called Problemata, or Problems, which refers to the problems raised by Abraham's reaction to the command of God. In this work, Kirkegaard, through his pseudonym, focuses on the difficult demands of faith, using Abraham as his example. Scholars have often taken his analysis here to be presenting a model for the difficulties involved in Christian faith. We want to take a more careful look at the first of the 3 Problemata in Fear and Trembling, which raises the question in its title, is there a teleological suspension of the ethical? Let's begin by having a look at the text to see what's meant by this. The chapter begins with a contrast between the universal and the single individual. By universal here, Kirkegaard means the sphere of generally accepted ethics and ways of behaving. He refers explicitly to a section in Hegel's book, The Philosophy of Right, which is a work on ethics and political philosophy that was published in 1821. We saw earlier that Hegel was interested in exploring what he called the ethical life of a people, for example, the ancient Greeks. This was a large sphere of interconnected elements of the public social order, for example, ethics, law, traditional customs, religious practices, and so forth. This conception of ethics is what Kirkegaard associates with the universal. It's universal since it's something that everyone knows and everyone participates in intuitively. According to this view, we know what our ethical duties are simply by looking at what the traditions and customs of our society tell us. In this sense, ethics is by definition what established custom dictates. For someone who defends this view, the great sin is to act in contradiction to the universally accepted ethics. When one acts for one's own selfish interests and disregards the universal duties that bind one, then one acts unethically. So, for example, both law and accepted ethics say that I should not steal. But I might be so focused on my own personal needs and interests in money so that I'm inclined to do so anyway. In this case, I put my personal desires above the universal. I act both illegally and immorally. This part seems entirely uncontroversial. But Kirkegaard brings in an example that makes this picture considerably more complex. He tries to understand the meaning and implications of the story of Abraham and Isaac in Genesis chapter 22. We all know the story. Isaac is Abraham's only son, who's apparently destined to be the next great patriarch to lead the people. But God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son on Mount Moriah. Needless to say, this was presumably very vexing for Abraham, since this meant not only killing his beloved son, but also ending his family line. But Abraham obeys God and takes Isaac with him to Mount Moriah, where he prepares everything for the sacrifice. Then, at the crucial moment when it's time for him actually to sacrifice Isaac, an angel appears and stops him and provides him with a ram to sacrifice instead. Kirkegaard points out that this story raises puzzling questions for the conception of ethics that we just discussed. According to the universal ethics, it's wrong and illegal to murder someone, not to mention for fathers to kill their own sons. So Abraham is acting in a way that's ethically wrong when seen from this perspective. It's as if he as an individual is overriding the universal ethics of the community. This is what Kirkegaard means by the phrase, the suspension of the ethical. In other words, Abraham has received a revelation from God that requires him to put aside, in this one instance, the universal rules and practices and traditions that govern the ethics of his people. In order to fulfill God's command, Abraham must suspend ethics and act, as it were, on the basis of something higher than this. He calls this a teleological suspension, since ethics are suspended for a higher telos, or end. Our intuitions seem, in a sense, to be split here, since on the one hand, we want to say, along with Hegel, that it's wrong to kill innocents and that there's nothing higher than this universal. But then, on the other hand, we also want to say that one should obey the command of God. But what if these two are in contradiction with one another, as they are here? Which is the correct course of action to take? Kirkegaard points out that, on Hegel's point of view, we would have to regard Abraham as a murderer, or perhaps more accurately, almost a murderer. But there seems to be something not quite right about this, since we want to regard Abraham as a faithful and pious man who's merely obeying the will of God. But according to the view of universal ethics, there's nothing higher than the universal, and thus the idea of a divine revelation being a reason to suspend the ethical can't really be recognized. This is the key interpretive point in the text. At first glance, it looks as if Kirkegaard, via his pseudonymous author, straightforwardly wants to defend the view that there can be a suspension of the ethical in cases like this. It looks as if he wants to criticize the universal view of ethics as being too narrow, since it fails to take into account exceptions to the rules. In a certain sense, it seems that he does want to say this, but the critical point is how he does so. The key here is that he doesn't argue for this discursively. He doesn't try to enumerate reasons for why Abraham is justified in doing what he's doing. On the contrary, he says flatly that this can't be done. The third problema is dedicated to an analysis of Abraham's silence, and Kirkegaard claims that it's essential that Abraham keeps silent about the motivations for his action. It would be wrong if he were to try to convince people that he was acting justly, since he was merely fulfilling God's command, which he had received in a revelation. He can't attempt to make arguments of this kind, since it all boils down to a matter of faith, and faith is something private. Faith is about the single individual, but language consists of universals. So if Abraham were to try to articulate his faith verbally, he would inevitably end up describing it with universals. His description would thus be a hopeless distortion of what he actually wants to express. Abraham can't convey to anyone else his own private faith. This is something that's non-discursive and ineffable. Any attempt to explain it or use it as a justification for his actions would be a distortion of it. Thus, Abraham must simply carry out the action and keep silent about it. He knows full well that he must accept the consequences of it if he were to be caught and persecuted legally. He knows that he can't use faith or his revelation as any kind of defense. The point that Kirkegaard seems to want to draw from his analysis in Fear and Trembling is less about ethics or political philosophy and more about religious faith. Indeed, throughout the work, he talks about a night of faith, which is clearly modeled on Abraham. Although the story of Abraham and Isaac is, of course, one that belongs to Judaism and the Old Testament, scholars have generally taken Abraham's obedience to God also to be a model for Christian faith, indeed, a model that Kirkegaard seems to want to recommend. So what does Kirkegaard say about faith in this context? In a famous line, he writes, "Faith is namely this paradox, that the single individual is higher than the universal." This is a sentence that scholars have argued about extensively. Kirkegaard's point seems to be that there are instances like that of Abraham where the individual takes precedence over accepted customs and universal ethics. Or, put differently, not all actions that are done based on one's own individuality or at the expense of the universal ethics should be summarily dismissed as something that's evil. The key thing to note is the way in which Kirkegaard puts this point. As we know, Christian apologetics is the branch of theology that attempts to defend the doctrines of Christianity. It tries to offer arguments and good reasons for believing in things such as the incarnation, the ascension, the virgin birth, and so forth. The goal of Christian apologetics is to convince skeptics or non-believers of the truth of the Christian faith. But note that Kirkegaard's approach is entirely different from this. As we've seen, he's trying to articulate the nature of Christian faith. Traditional Christian apologists would try to give good reasons and arguments for why faith is rational and well-grounded. They would try to make a positive case for Christian faith, but Kirkegaard does just the opposite. He says not that faith is reasonable or comprehensible, but rather that it's a paradox that can't be grasped discursively. He says that Abraham acts by virtue of the absurd. This can hardly be taken as a recommendation for faith or as a convincing argument against a skeptic of Christianity. If a skeptic were to demand a solid reason for thinking that Abraham received a revelation from God, and our response was that Abraham believed by virtue of the absurd, this would not go very far to convince anyone. To say that something is absurd is usually to discount it. It's not a positive argument for a position. Understanding faith as a paradox can be seen as what's been called a negative concept. That is, a concept that doesn't have concrete positive content, but rather leaves things open. By proposing the concept of faith as a paradox, Kirkegaard doesn't really solve definitively the problem about faith, but rather he problematizes the issue and in effect invites us, his readers, to continue to explore it on our own. Here we can see the spirit of Socrates once again in Kierkegaard's text. Socrates claims to be ignorant, and therefore he doesn't present any positive doctrine. Instead, he merely criticizes the views of others and reduces them to contradiction and absurdity. In a sense, Kirkegaard is doing the same thing here. He claims that faith is not something positive or concrete, but rather it's a paradox, a contradiction. Like Socrates' approach, this is negative. Nothing is really resolved, but rather the problem is left open as a problem. I'm joined again by Professor Heiko Schulz from the Faculty of Theology at the Johann Wolfgang von Goethe University in Frankfurt in Germany. Professor Schulz, Kirkegaard is often referred to as a thinker of passion. In your opinion, what does this mean? How is Kierkegaard's view of passion relevant for us today in the modern world? Some people might argue that with school shootings and other forms of modern violence that there's all too much passion. Do you think Kierkegaard's right when he says that what we need is more passion? Some people might argue to the contrary, that what we need is less.
Good question. Well, first of all, the title Kierkegaard as a thinker of passion is a complex one. It seems to me that we have to distinguish between at least four senses or four respects in which Kierkegaard can be talked about as a thinker of passion. First, he was obviously a passionate person himself, and in that sense he was a thinker of passion. He was passionate. But secondly, his passion, his basic passion, found expression in his thinking. So thinking was a passion of himself, and not everybody has the same or shares the same passions. His passion was thinking. And again, this passion for thinking found expression in thinking about passion itself. So that's a third sense which seems to be crucial here. And finally, he did not simply have the passion of thinking about passion, but he had the passion of thinking about the passion of thinking. So he was of the opinion that thinking itself is a form of passion. And in this fourfold sense, I think we have to talk about Kierkegaard as a thinker of passion. Now, is that relevant for our times? Kierkegaard's own diagnosis is in one of the journal notes that our time, or the 19th century already, is not so much a time or a society of evil individuals, but of wretched individuals, in the sense that these individuals lack passion. And at first sight, it would seem that nowadays this diagnosis does not obtain anymore because we have school shootings and other things, and we think there's too much passion going on. Wouldn't it be necessary to cool down and have a bit more of intellectual reflection and stuff like that? It seems to me Kierkegaard's basic diagnosis is that our times are qualified by, not so much by passionate acting, but by a lack of passion, or by wretchedness, what he calls wretchedness. And if we think of school shootings, and if we think of a lot of violence in our times, it seems to be that his diagnosis is anachronistic to a certain extent. But I don't think it is. I would make a distinction between reflected and unreflected passion. And thinking about books like Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, it seems to me this seems to be a valid distinction. Kierkegaard puts high requirements on Abraham as the one who's going to sacrifice his own son. And Kierkegaard says it's only legitimate to act like Socrates did by fulfilling those very strict requirements. Of course, what Abraham is about to do is a very passionate act. He's going to sacrifice his own son. And Kierkegaard says it's possible that this act is legitimate, is a teleological suspension of the ethical, at least if two requirements are fulfilled. Namely, first, you have to love whom you sacrifice, whom you're about to sacrifice. And secondly, the possible purpose for a greater community, like, say, the society or a state or whatever, can't be there. If there's any kind of possibility of transforming my act and the purpose of my act into such a greater community, then it can't be legitimate. Then it can't be a legitimate case of a teleological suspension of the ethical. So in that sense, you could say somebody who commits a school shooting or anything like that wouldn't, in all probability, wouldn't fulfill these requirements. And therefore, it couldn't be a reflected form of passion, but an unreflected form of passion, and in that sense, illegitimate. And so you could say, still, the diagnosis holds. Most people, or a lot of people, are lacking in passion on the one hand, and on the other hand, we find a lot of people who have passion but just have the wrong form of passion, namely unreflected passion.
Readers of Kirkegaard today are often perplexed and even confused at his theory of faith as a contradiction or a paradox. Does Kirkegaard really have a point with this, or does he just like to provoke and confuse people? How is this somewhat odd theory of faith relevant for us in the modern world today? At bottom, the key issue in Fear and Trembling is the relation of religious faith to the secular world with its laws, customs, and traditions. Abraham is a great model of piety and religious faith, but his actions potentially lead into conflict with the laws of his people. One might think that this is just an old story that has no relevance today, since no one would think of making human sacrifices today. But when one considers the matter further, one quickly realizes that in fact, this is a central and unresolved issue in our own day. Most countries here in Europe and in the West ensure the religious freedom of their citizens. This is a part of the Western heritage from the Enlightenment, and the basic freedom to believe what one wishes is enshrined in the constitutions of the laws of the state. The spirit of these laws is clearly to ensure that each individual has the right to pursue their religious practice without harassment or impediment, regardless of how unpopular those practices might be. But things are not always so simple. While countries say that they believe in religious freedom and have laws protecting it, there are limits to this. Specifically, the limits to religious freedom appear the moment that religious practices come into conflict with civil law. If my religion dictated that I, for example, murder people as human sacrifices, then the state could not allow this. There are, of course, less dramatic examples of this conflict in cases where, for example, religion requires its followers to take certain hallucinogenic drugs in connection with the religious rites. But these substances are illegal in some places. Or some religions sanction polygamy, which is illegal in the eyes of the state. Examples of this kind seem to imply that while religious freedom is a basic right, it's not unlimited. Rather, it must be exercised in a way that's consistent with civil law. Kirkegaard's view, or that of his pseudonymous author Johannes de Silentio, raises difficult problems for this picture. His difficult claim is that there can be cases where the individual is higher than the universal, where there can be a suspension of the generally accepted ethical and legal norms of the state and society. God's demand that Abraham sacrifice his beloved son is the prime example of this. One might say that Kirkegaard's clear implication here is that Abraham's action to sacrifice his son is not only okay, but even praiseworthy from a religious perspective. According to this view, Kirkegaard's message is that when one has a firm religious conviction, or when one receives a revelation from God to do something, then it's an absolute command that trumps ethics and civil law. One must simply follow this obediently. But doesn't this view lead to dangerous consequences? One often hears of criminals, for example, murderers who, in their defense, claim that God told them to do what they did. Likewise, many forms of terrorism are grounded in the deep-seated religious belief. Many terrorists also believe that they are fulfilling the will of God with their actions. Most of us are disinclined to accept this as a reason for the murder of innocent people. But does Kirkegaard's analysis of Abraham open the door for this kind of thing? If we were alive today, would Kirkegaard defend the actions of terrorists as great acts of piety? I don't think so. If we look closer, we can see that there are important elements in Kirkegaard's analysis that separate him from the modern murderer or terrorist. Perhaps most importantly, Kirkegaard emphasizes the paradoxical nature of faith. It's something that is contradictory and absurd. Moreover, faith is something entirely inward and can't be communicated directly to another person. For this reason, Abraham remains silent. This is an important point. The modern murderer or terrorist is inclined to use the religious motivation of their action as an argument in defense of it. In other words, the murderer says that God told him to kill someone, and the point of this is to explain the action and to defend it. But Kirkegaard's point is that this is a misunderstanding. One can never use the idea that one received a revelation from God and is acting on God's will as a defense for one's actions. It's true that one might believe this in the quiet of one's own mind, or as Kirkegaard says, in one's inwardness, but the moment one tries to communicate it, one shows that one has really not understood the nature of faith. He claims that faith is not objective and discursive, not communicable in this way. This is a fundamental difference between Kirkegaard's view and that of the modern murderer or terrorist who seeks to explain, justify, and defend their actions based on reasons, arguments, and discursive communication. So while it might look at face value as if Kirkegaard is offering a theory that might justify illegal and immoral acts and atrocities, a closer look shows that this is not the case. No justification can be sought from the side of religious faith. All of this raises important and very topical issues about the limits of religious freedom. Where exactly is the line where religious freedom stops and civil law begins? Can or should civil law make certain exceptions to accommodate certain religious practices, or should it lay down a certain consistent position that everyone in society is obliged to follow? Is religious faith compromised or convoluted if it's obliged to bend to the rules of mainstream society? Does civil law discriminate against certain minority religions in society? These are all very important issues in our own day. It's a great mistake to believe that the question of religious freedom was resolved with the Enlightenment. Instead, with the granting of religious freedom, a new set of issues and problems were ushered in. The years 1844 to 1846 were perhaps the most productive in Kirkegaard's entire life. In this lecture, we want to explore the series of famous works that he penned during this period, among others, the philosophical fragments, the concept of anxiety, prefaces, stages on life's way, and the concluding unscientific postscript. These books present a complex series of works, ostensibly authored by different pseudonyms, each with his own agenda and intentions. At first glance, this might all look like a kind of playful chaos or straightforward kind of madness on Kierkegaard's side. But in this lecture, we'll try to make sense of Kierkegaard's plan with these works and their complex relations to one another. What we'll see is that many of the main motifs concerning Socrates that Kierkegaard originally treated in the concept of irony now reappear in different contexts in these later works. While Socrates is never again made the central object of investigation as he was in Kierkegaard's master's thesis, he nonetheless haunts these later works in ways that are often not so easy to see. We'll explore how Kierkegaard returns to Socrates repeatedly as a source of inspiration. This is particularly interesting when we consider that these works treat important Christian concepts, such as the incarnation, the revelation, faith, sin, and forgiveness. Many people might think that it's outrageous to believe that a pagan philosopher can help to understand these Christian concepts. Here we catch a glimpse of the radicality of Kierkegaard's thought. He believes that Socrates has some important insights for Christians today. In one text, Kierkegaard acknowledges the objection, saying, quote, "True, Socrates was no Christian, that I know." But then Kierkegaard goes on to make the highly provocative and indeed enigmatic statement and continue, quote, "I also definitely remain convinced that he, Socrates, has become one. That is, that Socrates has become a Christian." So although Socrates was born and died centuries before Christ and before the birth of Christianity, nonetheless, Kierkegaard believes that Socrates became a Christian. What could he possibly have meant by this? Kierkegaard continued with his enormous productivity and published the book Philosophical Fragments, or Fragment of Philosophy, on June the 13th, 1844. Kierkegaard presents this work under the name of the pseudonym Johannes Climacus, although his own name appears on the title page as the editor of the work. The title of the work as Fragments is often taken as a protest against systematic philosophy. Socrates plays an important role, especially at the beginning of this work. There, Kierkegaard has his pseudonymous author explore Socrates' role as a teacher. This might strike us at first sight as inconsistent with what he said earlier about Socrates' insistence on his own ignorance and his denial that he ever taught anything. But there's no inconsistency here, and Johannes Climacus emphasizes that, in contrast to the 19th century, which was focused on constructing things and on positive content, quote, "Socrates lacked the positive." What then does Climacus mean here by designating Socrates as a teacher, since usually teachers are thought to convey certain material, or, in Kierkegaard's language, something positive? Here, Climacus makes reference to Socrates' art of maieudics, or midwifery. Socrates doesn't produce the ideas or thoughts in the student, but rather helps the student to find them within himself. So in this sense, Socrates is a teacher, since he's the occasion for the student to arrive at the truth. But Socrates doesn't teach him the truth. Philosophical Fragments is about the doctrine of the incarnation and the revelation of Jesus Christ. But Kierkegaard is careful not to mention Jesus by name or to cast the analysis explicitly in terms of Christianity. For this reason, he talks merely about the God without any further designation. The idea is that this could apply to any religion in principle. Kierkegaard contrasts Socrates' role as midwife with the role of Christ as Savior, who's also the occasion for his followers to learn the truth. Kierkegaard is keen to point out some important contrasts between the Socratic model and the Christian model, but the comparison in itself is interesting. While Socrates is obviously not Christian, his idea of midwifery can be useful in helping us to understand the Christian truth. Kierkegaard also uses Socrates to introduce the notion of the absolute paradox. He begins chapter 3 of the work by recounting a passage from Plato's dialogue, The Phaedrus, where Socrates says that He was not interested in exploring the nature of certain mythological creatures, such as Pegasus and the Gorgons, because he was primarily concerned with discovering what he himself was as a human being. He claims to be ignorant of what he himself is and is uncertain whether he might not be a monster like Typhon. Kirkegaard has Johannes Climacus refer to this as a paradox. He defines this as the desire, quote, to want to discover something that thought itself cannot think. For Socrates, this means apparently understanding what he is ultimately as a human being, which he can never quite grasp. The understanding wants to grasp what is unknown and is constantly frustrated when it encounters what is unknown. This unknown must be something absolutely different, since if it were similar to us, then we could know it by recognizing certain aspects of it that we're familiar with. The human mind can't grasp what's absolutely different. Johannes Climacus suggests that we call the unknown the God. The analysis then subtly shifts over into a Christian context, although again, this is not stated explicitly. The unspoken issue is the Christian doctrine of incarnation, according to which God became incarnated as a human being, Jesus Christ, and revealed himself. God is unknown, but wants to make himself known by means of the revelation. According to Johannes Climacus, this too involves a paradox. God is infinite and eternal, but yet he became finite and temporal with the incarnation. This seems to be a straightforward contradiction. Climacus calls it a paradox, indeed the absolute paradox. This contradiction is not something that the human mind can grasp or think. It thus stands as a contradiction that we must accept. This is clearly meant as a response to the idea of mediation that was found in the works of figures such as Martensen, who were influenced by Hegel. According to the Hegelian view, there are no absolute dichotomies or contradictions, and everything can be mediated. So, as we've seen, according to Martensen, there's no absolute difference between human and divine, or between finite and infinite, temporal and eternal. Each of these terms is necessarily related to the other, and thus mediated by it. Jointly, they form a higher conceptual structure, since they must be regarded as belonging together organically. When one understands the terms in this way, it's possible to give a philosophical explanation of the incarnation and the revelation of Christ. This is something that can be understood by using Hegel's speculative logic, and there's no contradiction in thinking that God, as the infinite, became finite. It was this explanation that Kirkegaard objected to. With the doctrine of the absolute paradox, he clearly wants to insist that the revelation is an example of an absolutely fixed, irreducible dichotomy, an either-or that cannot be mediated. He uses Socrates as his model, as someone who accepts that there are some things that he cannot know or understand, who accepts that there are some things that must be regarded as paradoxes. Kirkegaard published his next major work on June the 17th, 1844, namely The Concept of Anxiety, which is ascribed to the pseudonymous author Virgilius Halfniensis, or the Watchman of Copenhagen. This work appeared only 4 days after Philosophical Fragments, and on the same day as another book entitled Prefaces. The Concept of Anxiety is one of Kierkegaard's most scholarly works, along with The Concept of Irony. It treats the complex set of issues concerning the freedom of the individual and hereditary sin. It's in this context that his influential analysis of anxiety appears. It seems odd, then, that in a work about the Christian dogma of sin, that the pagan philosopher Socrates would play a role. But once again, it's clear that Kirkegaard is constantly looking to Socrates as a model and as a source of inspiration. Socrates is mentioned at the very beginning of the work in the opening motto that follows the title page. He's compared positively to modern philosophy. The motto begins, quote, "The age of making distinctions is past. It has been vanquished by the system." This refers to the Hegelian doctrine of mediation that, as we've seen, brings together opposites, or, as is implied here, eliminates distinctions. By means of Hegel's logic, opposite terms such as being and nothing, finite and infinite, one and many, can be mediated by showing the necessary relation of the one side of the opposition to the other. To hold firmly to one side of an opposite and to fail to recognize the other is, according to Hegel, the sign of dogmatism. For Kirkegaard, by contrast, the key is to keep the oppositions and contradictions in focus and not to mediate them. His slogan, either or, emphasizes that one is obliged to take one side or the other, and no mediation is possible. Now here, in the motto to the concept of anxiety, Socrates is invoked as someone who, like Kirkegaard, insisted on distinctions. It's noted that this might seem somewhat eccentric in modern times, now that people are used to Hegel's philosophy. Kirkegaard quotes the German philosopher Johann Georg Hamann, who was also a great admirer of Socrates. Hamann writes, quote, "For Socrates was great in that he distinguished between what he understood and what he did not understand." By using this as the motto of the work, Kirkegaard seems to imply that he wishes to follow the lead of Socrates and insist on unshakable distinctions in order to resist mediation. Kirkegaard dedicated the concept of anxiety to his old teacher, Paul Martin Müller, who had died in 1838. Socrates' name also appears in this dedication when Müller is referred to as, quote, "the confidant of Socrates." This seems to confirm the idea that we discussed earlier, namely that Müller's interest in Socrates and Socratic irony played an important role in Kierkegaard's intellectual development and might well have served as a part of the inspiration for his book, The Concept of Irony. In the introduction to the concept of anxiety, Kierkegaard mentions Socrates when he presents the topic of the work, namely the concept of sin. He begins by making the following claim, quote, "Sin does not properly belong in any academic field, but it is the subject of the sermon, in which the single individual speaks as the single individual to the single individual." This assertion will strike theologians as somewhat odd, since traditionally the dogma of sin has belonged to the scholarly field of theology, and specifically dogmatics. Here, at the outset, Kierkegaard has his pseudonymous author indicate that his approach and understanding of sin will be something very different indeed, something at odds with the scholarly account. Also somewhat odd is his description of a sermon. Usually we think of a sermon as something like a lecture, where a priest or a pastor explains a certain biblical passage or idea to the congregation. But also here, Kierkegaard wants to signal a different understanding. While he admits that some pastors in his own day have been corrupted by scholarship and recent philosophical trends, and thus give sermons that sound like lectures, this is not the true nature of the sermon. Then comes the truly surprising passage. Kirkegaard writes, quote, "But to preach is really the most difficult of all arts, and is essentially the art that Socrates praised, the art of being able to converse." This seems very odd, since Socrates, of course, never attended a Christian church service and never heard a sermon in his entire life. But Kierkegaard has Virgilius Haufniensis compare Socrates' form of conversing and discussing with a Christian sermon. The key term in both cases is what Kierkegaard refers to as appropriation. The idea for Socrates is that through his questioning and conversation, the individual is led to find the truth within himself. This means taking something and giving it their own interpretation or appropriation in one's own special context. So also with the sermon, the pastor, instead of simply preaching some external fact or bit of knowledge, encourages the individual members of the congregation to find the truth of Christianity in themselves, each in their own way. Every follower of Christ must appropriate the Christian message for him or herself. So for Kierkegaard, the key here is that the truth, both for Socrates and for Christianity, is something inward that must be appropriated by people as individuals. So even though Socrates is not a Christian thinker, he can nonetheless give us insight into Christianity. In chapter 4 of The Concept of Anxiety, Kierkegaard again has his pseudonymous author contrast Socrates with modern philosophy, and especially Hegel. This appears in the context of a discussion of the notion of negation and what Kierkegaard refers to as enclosed reserve. The Danish term that's translated as enclosed reserved is insluthed, and it means literally something like closing oneself off from the world or from other people. It's natural to understand negativity in this context, since when one is closed off into oneself, it can be said that one negates the outside world. We've seen how important negation is in Kirkegaard's understanding of irony. In the passage in question from the concept of anxiety, reference is made to Hegel's treatment of Socrates, which we studied earlier in this course. Kirkegaard writes, quote, "Thus irony has been explained as the negative. Hegel was the first to discover this explanation, but strangely enough, he did not know much about irony." Hegel's lack of understanding is then contrasted to Socrates' full appreciation of the importance of irony. Kirkegaard continues in the same passage, quote, "that it was Socrates who first introduced irony into the world and gave a name to the child, that this irony was precisely enclosing reserve, which began by closing himself off from men, by closing himself in within himself, in order to be expanded in the divine. This is something that no one is concerned with." Here, Kirkegaard again emphasizes the element of subjectivity that Socrates introduced. There's something infinitely important and valuable in each and every individual, but to get to this, one must occasionally get away from the crowd and from other people. This distancing oneself from others involves negation and irony. One must instead focus on one's own inwardness and religiosity. Kirkegaard takes Socrates to be the first one to have realized this. Here again, we see an intriguing juxtaposition of an issue concerning Christian faith and the practice of a pagan philosopher, which Kirkegaard uses as a model. Enclosed reserve is another important Kierkegaardian concept that makes use of the idea of negation and irony from Socrates. We saw in the sixth lecture how the critic Johann Ludwig Heiberg wrote a critical review of Either Or that earned him Kierkegaard's animosity. While Kierkegaard responded with the article "A Word of Thanks to Professor Heiberg," this was by no means the end of the conflict. Heiberg was known for his famous literary journals, such as Københavns Flyvende Post or Copenhagen's Flying Post. At the beginning of 1844, Heiberg founded a new journal entitled Urania, which had an entirely new profile. At this time, Heiberg had become interested in astronomy, and this journal was intended to encourage new research in this field. It was on the second floor of this house, where Heiberg lived at that time, where he built his own private observatory. In the first issue of his new journal, Heiberg wrote an article entitled "The Astronomical Year." In this piece, he discusses the various changes that occur in nature, such as the movements of the planets and the changing of the seasons. In this context, he comes to mention Kierkegaard's new book, Repetition. He writes, quote, "In a recently published work, which even has the word repetition as its title, something very beautiful and fitting is said about this concept, but the author has not distinguished between the essentially different meanings which repetition has in the sphere of nature and in the sphere of spirit." As in his earlier review of Either Or, Heiberg initially acknowledges something positive in Kierkegaard's work, but then criticizes it for misunderstanding something quite fundamental. Kierkegaard was angered by Heiberg's remarks here, just as he had been angered by the previous review of Either Or. He drafted a couple of different articles in response to Heiberg, but in the end, he never published these. Kierkegaard saved his polemical response to Heiberg for his next book, entitled simply Prefaces. This book appeared on June the 17th, 1844, and is written under the guise of the pseudonymous author Nicholas Notabene. This is a somewhat odd book in that it consists of a series of different prefaces to other texts which were never written. It appears that Kierkegaard had a handful of unused texts just lying around, but they could not be really used for anything. Some of these texts included materials relevant for his criticism of Heiberg. So Kierkegaard hit upon the idea of publishing them in a single text with the title Prefaces. He had to give some kind of reason for why these texts were presented in this odd way, and so he concocted the following story. The author, Nicholas Notabene, is a married man, and his wife is angry with him because he spends so much time writing books and not enough time with her. So she forbids him from writing books. Nota Bene, however, is enamored in writing and can't desist, and so he tries to get around his wife's prohibition by writing not books, but instead just prefaces. This explains why the book consists of a series of 8 prefaces that, in a sense, stand alone and are not prefaces to any particular book. In the work, Heiberg is mentioned directly several times, and in some passages, the perceptive reader can recognize Kirkegaard's response to both the review of either-or and the critical discussion of repetition. Indeed, Nota Bene criticizes the entire culture of literary critics and the industry of book reviews in the second preface. As we saw in Lecture 6, in his article, A Word of Thanks to Professor Heiberg, Kirkegaard satirized Heiberg's constant use of the impersonal pronoun one in his review of either-or. Now here, in the fourth of the prefaces, he does the same thing when he writes, quote, "What, I wonder, will one say about this book now? My dear reader, if you're not able to find out in any other way, then our literary telegraph manager, Professor Heiberg, will probably be kind enough to be a tax collector again and tally the votes just as he did in connection with either-or." So it seems that one of Kirkegaard's primary goals in prefaces was to criticize Heiberg and certain things that he stands for in the public eye, such as literary criticism and Hegelian philosophy. As a young man, Johann Ludwig Heiberg lived in a house in Gammelstrand, just about 50 meters from here. The house was located just across the canal, facing the royal palace. The last of Kirkegaard's prefaces, namely preface number 8, is also a criticism of Heiberg, but it's particularly interesting for our purposes, since in it, Kirkegaard again employs some of the strategies that he learned from Socrates. This preface is ostensibly a preface to a new philosophical journal that Nicholas Nota Bene wants to found. He begins by referring to Heiberg's philosophical journal, Perseus, which began in 1837. The subtitle of Perseus is A Journal for the Speculative Idea, which indicates Heiberg's intention. This journal is supposed to serve the purpose of spreading information about Hegel's speculative philosophy in Denmark. In the end, Heiberg's journal saw only 2 issues, in 1837 and 1838, and was then discontinued. Nicholas Nota Bene then contemplates his own prospects of succeeding with the new philosophical journal, given that Heiberg's journal didn't flourish, despite the fact that Heiberg had extensive editorial experience and academic connections. Nicholas Nota Bene recalls that Heiberg, in his treatise On the Significance of Philosophy for the Present Age, claimed that philosophy was the demand of the age, or in other words, philosophy was what was needed to help the age get past the forms of relativism and subjectivism that are so dominant. Given this diagnosis, Heiberg's attempt to found a new philosophical journal makes perfect sense. He takes this to be the cure for the ills of the day. Nicholas Nota Bene says that he too wants to serve philosophy with his new journal, but his service is quite different from that of Heiberg's journal. Instead of using his journal to explain philosophy to his readers, as Heiberg does, Nota Bene admits openly that he doesn't understand philosophy and that his journal will invite contributors to explain it to him. Nota Bene asks for the approval of his readers when he explains his goal to work for philosophy by asking people to teach him about it. Quote, "Isn't this purpose good, and isn't it different from that of those who heretofore have tried to publish a philosophical journal, even if it is in harmony with theirs in wanting to serve philosophy? Yet the services are different. One serves it with his wisdom, another with his stupidity." Just as Socrates claimed to know nothing, Nota Bene claims to be straightforwardly stupid. Nota Bene refers to himself in an entirely humble and self-effacing manner, while at the same time recognizing Heiberg as one of the leading cultural figures in Danish letters at the time. Just as Socrates invites others to teach him and to explain to him what they know, so also Nota Bene invites contributors to his journal who can teach him and explain him the new philosophy. Like Socrates, Nota Bene refrains from making any positive claims himself, but instead simply listens to the claims of others and critically evaluates them. Heiberg was, of course, known for his promotion of Hegel's philosophy in Denmark, and so Nota Bene grants that Hegel's philosophy has explained everything. This is the same as Socrates' point of departure. He always grants immediately the claims of his interlocutors to know something. Nota bene merely states that he doesn't understand the account that Hegel's philosophy gives, and so he politely asks for an explanation of it. So also Socrates, after having heard the explanations or definitions given by his interlocutors, claims not to fully understand their explanation, and so he begins to ask follow-up questions which reveal that the explanation is contradictory and thus unsatisfying. Nota bene then, like Socrates, ironically states his expectation to be enlightened about this. Quote, "Since we now have so many philosophers here in Denmark who, with industry and good fortune, have comprehended this philosophy, I happily expect the instruction for which I have wished." Socrates often begins by flattering his interlocutors for the knowledge they possess, thereby making it more difficult for them to refuse to answer his questions after they have accepted his recognition. So also Nota bene seems to oblige the Danish followers of Hegel to respond, since they're publicly known to have an understanding of Hegel's philosophy, which Nota bene is the first to recognize. But given their public reputation as experts in this philosophy, these people, like Heiberg, have no excuse for not responding, as it were, to Nota bene's call for papers. With this context set up in this way, it is Heiberg who appears in the role of one of Socrates' interlocutors, perhaps even one of the sophists, someone who claims to know things and to teach things, but who, in fact, is ignorant, and even ignorant of his own ignorance. Here we can see how Kirkegaard takes his initial inspiration from Socrates and then translates it into his own modern Danish cultural milieu. Kierkegaard's next important work was Stages on Life's Way, which appeared on April 30th, 1845. This is another complex pseudonymous book that in many ways recalls Either Or and seems to be a kind of sequel to it. The pendant to Victor Eremita from Either Or is Hilarius Bobinder, the pseudonymous editor responsible for the publication of the new book. Like Victor Eremita, Hilarius Bobinder claims to have found texts that constitute the work. The book consists of 3 long chapters with what amount to 4 different texts by 4 different authors. First, there's In Vino Veritas, which is attributed to William Afam. Then there's a text entitled Some Reflections on Marriage in Answer to Objections, which is written by a married man, that is, Judge William, the author of the second part of Either Or. Finally, the third large chapter consists of 2 works. There's a text entitled Guilty, Not Guilty by Quidem, the Latin name for someone. With respect to form, this text recalls The Seducer's Diary from Either Or. It's the story of a young man who, like Kirkegaard, breaks off an engagement to his beloved fiancée. And as the title indicates, it's a meditation on his degree of culpability in the matter. This inspires another long text called Letter to the Reader by Frater Taciturnus, who claims to have found the manuscript of Guilty, Not Guilty at the bottom of a lake. Stages on Life's Way thus represents a complex embedding of stories within stories. While readers have been quick to try to identify Kirkegaard with, for example, Quidem, it's clear that the text as a whole is set up in a way such that Kirkegaard himself hides behind the different authors. Not only is the work pseudonymous, but it also contains a handful of different authors with convoluted relations to one another. There are thus many different levels of distancing of Kirkegaard as an author from the texts that comprise the work. Kierkegaard's use of Socrates, or Socratic strategy, does, however, play an unmistakable role here. Indeed, Socrates is mentioned in all of the texts that appear in the book. Perhaps most notable is the section In Vino Veritas, where one can see clear signs of this influence. The title, In Vino Veritas, is Latin and means simply, in wine, the truth. That is, when people drink, they lose their inhibitions and speak the truth. The text presents a series of speeches at a dinner party on the subject of love. The participants in the dinner party who give the speeches are well-known Kierkegaardian pseudonyms: Johannes the Seducer, Victor Eremita, Constantine Constantius, and the young man from Repetition. The model that Kirkegaard uses for In Vino Veritas is clearly Plato's dialogue, The Symposium, which likewise presents a banquet scene in a series of speeches on the topic of love. Kirkegaard self-consciously uses the Platonic dialogue to stage his own symposium with its own speeches. Towards the end of Stages on Life's Way, in the letter to the reader, Frater Taciturnus discusses the religious question of sin and forgiveness. He understands the original state of human beings as that of immediacy, that is, living in immediate harmony with nature and the world. Then there is sin, and the immediacy is broken. This is the stage of reflection. The religious question is how to return to immediacy and undo the damage done by sin. Frater Taciturnus talks about a third stage as the forgiveness of sin. This is what he refers to as a second immediacy. The harmony between humans and the world is restored, but it's no longer the same harmony as at the beginning. Clearly, he has in mind here the Christian doctrine of the forgiveness of sin by means of Jesus Christ. Socrates is invoked in this context. Frater Taciturnus emphasizes the difficulty of the Christian doctrine and warns against those people who claim to understand it. Here, he's presumably referring to the academic theologians or well-educated clergy of the day. He notes that he is aware that in the eyes of such people, he will be regarded as a stupid person who asks foolish questions. But he says that it doesn't bother him to be regarded in this way. Indeed, this was the way that many people regarded Socrates, who said that he didn't know anything and pestered people with his questions. In the passage, Frater Taciturnus imagines what Socrates would say about the issue of sin and forgiveness and the responses of Kierkegaard's contemporaries. He has Socrates say, quote, "Surely what you're asking about is a difficult matter, and it has always amazed me that so many could believe that they understood a teaching such as that. But it had amazed me even more that some people have even understood much more." Here we can see Kierkegaard, through his pseudonym, again taking up a Socratic posture vis-a-vis his contemporaries. He recognizes the difficulty and complexity of the issue, which others fail to see. What does it mean to say that our sins are forgiven by Christ? He is content to remain in a situation of ignorance and uncertainty, even if this means being the subject of public ridicule. This disposition reflects in his eyes the contradictory, paradoxical, and absurd nature of Christian belief that his contemporaries fail to appreciate. He thus evokes Socrates to help in maintaining the correct disposition towards these issues. Once again, although it seems odd for us to imagine Socrates helping people to understand a Christian doctrine, Kierkegaard finds it extremely useful, and for this reason, he returns to Socrates repeatedly as a model to follow. One of the best-known parts of Kierkegaard's biography is his famous conflict with the satirical journal The Corsair. In Kierkegaard's time, this was a highly popular publication that featured humorous articles that made fun of well-known figures. The articles were often accompanied by cartoons and comic illustrations that delighted the readers. This journal was published by a talented writer named Meyer Goldschmidt, who continually found himself in legal trouble due to the journal's frequent conflict with the Danish censors. In order to avoid the problem, Goldschmidt had to engage a series of proxy editors who on paper were responsible for the journal, while he himself ran things behind the scene. Thus, when the authorities tried to prosecute the Corsair with legal action, they had no other recourse but to punish the proxy editor who was legally responsible. Goldschmidt's colleague at the journal was another highly talented and promising young writer and critic by the name of Peter Ludwig Müller, who played a key role in the conflict with Kirkegaard. Kierkegaard is known for his great animosity towards Goldschmidt and the Corsair, but this wasn't always the case. Prior to the actual conflict, the two had known about each other for about 10 years and were in fact on fairly good terms. Indeed, in 1841, the Corsair published a book review of Kierkegaard's The Concept of Irony, and there was no problem or conflict in that initial context. Similarly, in 1843, the Corsair published a positive review of Either Or that recognized Kierkegaard's gifts as a writer. The controversy itself began at the end of 1845 with a review of Stages on Life's Way by Peter Ludwig Müller. Oddly, although this was the beginning of Kierkegaard's conflict with the Corsair, Müller's review was published not in that journal, but in his own publication entitled Gaia. It was not uncommon for scholars and literary writers of the time to publish their own journals in this way. Indeed, we need only recall Kierkegaard's publication of The Moment some years later. Müller's journal Gaia was, unlike the Corsair, a very serious organ for literary criticism. It was here that Müller published an article entitled A Visit to Suru, which was, in effect, a critical treatment of Kierkegaard's Stages on Life's Way. Suru is a small town in Denmark that was the home of the famous Suru Academy, which employed a number of famous scholars and writers. One of these was the poet and novelist Carsten Hauch. In his article, Müller creates a fictional dialogue that is said to take place at Hauch's home in Suru, where Kierkegaard's Stages on Life's Way is the central object of discussion. There, Kierkegaard's work is criticized for its awkward style and for the way in which the author puts his own ethical development on show. Kierkegaard responded to this article with a piece of his own entitled The Activity of a Traveling Aesthetician and How He Still Happened to Pay for the Dinner. This article was published in the journal The Fatherland on December the 27th, 1845, and it appeared under the name of his pseudonym, Frater Taciturnus, that is, the pseudonym of Stages on Life's Way. Kierkegaard refuses to engage in any of the substantial criticisms of his work that were raised by Müller. Rather, he implies that Müller is trying to win public acclaim by associating himself with the literary elite of the day, by, among other things, placing the discussion of Kierkegaard's book at the home of Carsten Hauch. So at the end of the article, Kierkegaard associates Müller with the Corsair, even though, as we just mentioned, Müller's initial articles appeared in the journal Gaia and not in Goldschmidt's Corsair. Kierkegaard's point was, in effect, to show that while Müller was pretending to associate on friendly terms with the sophisticated literary elite of the country, in fact, he was writing for a journal of ill repute. So he sarcastically invites Müller to show his true colors and to criticize him in the Corsair. Now, why is that so important, so significant? This was a serious breach of academic ethics at the time. While Müller had collaborated with Goldschmidt on the Corsair, this was a secret between them. Müller was hoping for an appointment at the University of Copenhagen, and so he was keen to present himself as a serious literary scholar and not as someone who was writing for a disreputable journal. In private conversations, Goldschmidt had assured Kirkegaard that he alone was responsible for the Corsair. He warned Kirkegaard not to implicate Müller in this, but his pleas were to no avail. This had serious consequences for Müller's career and perhaps ultimately ruined his chances for academic employment. But an alternative interpretation might say that Müller's chances at a professorship were undermined not so much by his association with the Corsair, but rather by the general perception that Kierkegaard had gotten the better of him in the debate. Müller attempted to respond to Kierkegaard's article 2 days later, also in the paper The Fatherland, that is the paper where Kierkegaard's original piece appeared. Müller tries to deflect Kierkegaard's ad hominem criticism by saying that the dialogue he presented in his article was of course fictional, and thus there's no attempt to gain importance by associating himself with literary figures such as Carsten Hauch. Kierkegaard then in turn responded to this soon thereafter in an article entitled The Dialectical Result of a Literary Police Action. This was a serious attack on the Corsair that deeply vexed Müller, who saw his reputation damaged forever. Kirkegaard, again in the name of Frater Taciturnus, compares the Corsair with a prostitute and emphasizes its goal to make money at the expense of others. This was Kierkegaard's last article in the conflict, but the damage was done. Over the next few years, Kierkegaard was frequently mentioned in a satirical way in the Corsair, and even worse, He was depicted in masterfully executed cartoon sketches that made fun of both his person and his writings. Kirkegaard felt humiliated when he found himself to be the object of public ridicule in this way. He'd always taken great care to cultivate a certain public image of himself and to maintain a certain relation to his readers. But now he saw that these things were not entirely in his own control. He believed that the Corsair was intent on ruining his reputation and came to regard himself as a martyr of unfair public opinion. He developed an uncompromising hatred towards primarily Goldschmidt for his role in all of this. Kirkegaard's journals are full of statements of wrath against Müller, Goldschmidt, and the Corsair. Even when this material was published after Kierkegaard's death, Goldschmidt himself showed great magnanimity in the matter and refused to criticize Kirkegaard as a person, despite the abuse that Kierkegaard unreservedly hurled at him. In any case, this was, without a doubt, one of the signal controversies in Danish literary history that left its marks on all three of the main figures who were involved in it. Kirkegaard published the concluding unscientific postscript on February the 28th, 1846. This is regarded by many as his magnum opus, and Kirkegaard himself indicates that it played a very special role for him in the development of his work. The full title of the book is The Concluding Unscientific Postscript to Philosophical Fragments, a mimical, pathetical, dialectical compilation, an existential contribution. The work is thus conceived as the sequel to the Philosophical Fragments, and for this reason, it's ascribed to the same pseudonymous author of that work, Johannes Climacus. We know that Kirkegaard liked to take walks here, in Frederiksberg Garden, which is located in a suburb of Copenhagen, about a 30-minute walk from the old city. In the postscript, his pseudonymous author, Johannes Climacus, recounts that 4 years previously, he came here one Sunday afternoon and sat outside this cafe here, smoking a cigar. He claims that at this time he was considering the idea of becoming an author. One's tempted to read this story of Johannes Climacus biographically, or we could say autobiographically, as referring to Kirkegaard himself. We know that 4 years prior to the postscript, that is in 1842, Kirkegaard was just returning from Berlin and was in fact contemplating what he wanted to do with his life. It was presumably during this time that he hit upon the idea of becoming an author and constructing his authorship with a series of pseudonymous and signed works. In any case, the point of Johannes Climacus telling this story about the beginning of his authorship and his initial inspirations is to contrast this account in a humorous way with the account told by Johann Ludwig Heiberg of his conversion to Hegel's philosophy. As we discussed in the fourth lecture, Heiberg attended Hegel's lectures in Berlin, and he gives a very excited and romanticized account of his first great insight into Hegel's philosophy, which served as the inspiration for many of his later works. He describes this as a kind of epiphany that he experienced on his return from Berlin to Kiel. Heiberg writes, and I quote, "While resting on the way home in Hamburg, where I stayed 6 weeks before returning to Kiel, and during that time was constantly pondering what was still obscure to me, it happened one day that, sitting in my room in the inn, the König von England, with Hegel on my table and in my thoughts, and listening at the same time to the beautiful hymns which sounded almost unceasingly from the chimes of St. Peter's Church, suddenly, in a way which I have experienced neither before nor since, I was gripped by a momentary inner vision, as if a flash of lightning had illuminated the whole region for me and awakened in me the theretofore hidden central thought. From this moment, the system in its broad outline was clear to me, and I was completely convinced that I had grasped it in its innermost core, regardless of however much there might be in the details, which I had still not made my own, and perhaps never will." Kirkegaard has Johannes Climacus satirize this account by referring to Heiberg as Dr. Hjortspring. He makes fun of Heiberg's conversion to Hegel's philosophy as a miracle that took place at Hotel Streit in Hamburg. By contrast, Johannes Climacus gives a humble account of his own beginnings and his limited contributions to Danish literature. There's nothing romanticized about his portrayal of his decision to become an author here in Frederiksberg Garden. Climacus explains that as he sat here in the cafe with his cigar, he reflected on how he was getting older and still had not taken on any vocation. He saw other men with great talent working hard in different fields in order to make life easier. He recalls the different technological advances of the day, such as steamships and railroads. Similarly, Heiberg, by popularizing Hegel's philosophy, makes it easier for people to understand the German philosopher's difficult philosophical system. When Climacus considered what these other people were doing with their lives and how they were benefiting the age, the inevitable question arose about what he was doing with his life. He then hit upon the idea of what his vocation should be. He would benefit the age not by making things easier, but rather by making something more difficult. He points out that there's a danger in an age when things become too easy, and so it's important to have someone who can guard against this danger and point out the difficulties. All this might sound simply like Kirkegaard playing a joke on us, and to be sure there is an ironical or satirical tone in these passages, but there's also something very serious about it. He refers to the philosophical fragments, the first work by Johannes Climacus. One of the goals of that book was, in a sense, to make the belief in Christianity more difficult by the analysis of the absolute paradox. So when Climacus says here that his planned life vocation was to make things difficult, he means more specifically the idea of revising the conception of Christianity of the day and making it more difficult. This seems clearly to be Kierkegaard's own task, and he seemed clearly to regard Socrates as a model for it. In one chapter, Kirkegaard has his pseudonymous author Johannes Climacus go through and explain the goals and strategy of his previous work, the philosophical fragments. At the end of his discussion, there's an interesting comparison with Socrates. Climacus states that his intention was not to elaborate on Christian doctrine or dogma, but rather to address the question of how one becomes a Christian. In this context, he says something that's quite counterintuitive. The missionary tradition in Christianity has a set of well-known pattern for how Christians explain to non-Christians what Christianity is. The goal of the missionary is to convert the non-believer. This means conversion is usually about arguments and different forms of persuasion. The missionary tries to demonstrate the confusion and contradictions involved in the non-believer's worldview and the consistency and plausibility of Christianity. The whole point of this exercise is to show that it's attractive to be a Christian and unattractive to be a non-believer. Now, against this background, it's very odd when Johannes Climacus says that his goal is not to make becoming and being a Christian easier, but rather more difficult. He writes, I quote, "I venture according to my poor ability to take on the responsibility of making it difficult as possible." This seems a very odd thing to say. Is the meaning of this that Johannes Climacus is a kind of anti-missionary whose goal is not to persuade people from becoming Christians, but rather to do just the opposite, to repel them from Christianity? The key here is to understand what he means by Christianity. Since Christianity promises salvation and eternal happiness, it's a matter of the utmost importance to be sure about. It would be disastrous if one believed that one was a Christian, but yet, in fact, was not, since one had a mistaken conception of what Christianity was. Kirkegaard believes that the understanding and practice of Christianity in his own day is largely misconceived and deviates radically from the original Christianity taught by Jesus. The conception of Christianity is much more difficult to live up to than the watered-down modern version. So when Climacus says that his goal is to make it more difficult to be a Christian, he doesn't mean that he wants to destroy or undermine Christianity per se, but only what he regards as a certain mistaken version of Christianity that makes things too easy. This needs to be undermined so that one can come to grasp the true version of Christianity, which is more difficult. According to Climacus, Christianity concerns the inwardness of each individual and not discursive arguments or demonstrations. He objects to the idea that Christianity is a doctrine. This is also a radical and counterintuitive claim. Throughout the history of Christianity, there have constantly been attempts to formalize the teachings of Christ as a fixed doctrine. This began with the very first church councils and continued through history with countless theologians and scholars developing their own system of Christian dogmatics, that is, the field of theology that tries to understand the different dogmas. Moreover, the religious controversies that led to schisms in the history of the church concerned disputes about the interpretation of specific dogmas or doctrines. In religious wars, people fought and died for what they believed to be the truth of specific doctrines. Likewise, people were persecuted and tortured, even executed, for not believing in certain doctrines. Now, given all this, it's strikingly odd when Johannes Climacus implies that it's a mistake to understand Christianity as a doctrine. He writes, I quote, "The introducing that I take upon myself consists by repelling in making it difficult to become a Christian, and understands Christianity not as a doctrine, but as an existence contradiction and existence communication." His point is that there is a contradiction at the heart of Christianity, presumably that of the idea of God becoming man, the infinite becoming finite, the eternal becoming temporal. In short, the idea of the paradox explored in the philosophical fragments. But as we've seen, this isn't a positive doctrine, but rather stands in the way of one. It's a declaration that this key point in Christianity can never be comprehended by the human mind. It can never be explained to another person. Rather, it must simply be accepted in the inwardness of one's own heart. This seems to be what Climacus means in the passage with an existence communication, which is just the opposite of an objective, direct, or straightforward communication of a fact about the world. Instead, an existence communication concerns something that's paradoxical, contradictory, and absurd. Towards the end of this discussion, Kirkegaard has Johannes Climacus compare his approach with that of Socrates. He refers specifically to the dialogue The Greater Hippias, which concerns the question of the nature of beauty. Just as Climacus wants to introduce people to Christianity, so also the goal of Plato's dialogues is to introduce people to the concept of beauty. This is one of Plato's so-called aporetic dialogues, and so after many failed attempts to define beauty, the discussion ends with no conclusion. At the end, Socrates states simply that he has benefited from the conversation since he found the issue of defining beauty to be so difficult. Johannes Climacus sees this as an analogy to his approach to Christianity. He doesn't attempt to teach any positive doctrine about what Christianity is, just as Socrates doesn't attempt to teach a single straightforward definition of beauty. Instead, the idea of Christianity and the concept of beauty are themselves problematized. Climacus takes this to be important and indeed beneficial in his own age, which, in his opinion, is dominated by confused and mistaken conceptions of Christianity. So, if readers can come away from his text questioning and doubting their views of Christianity, then this is an important result, even if he's not taught them a positive doctrine. So here again, we see Socrates providing a model for Kierkegaard's project. Like the Socrates of the Greater Hippias, who makes things more difficult with regard to the concept of beauty, so also Kierkegaard sees himself as making things more difficult with regard to Christianity. Why did Kierkegaard regard the concluding unscientific postscript as such an important work? The key lies in the word concluding in the title. The obvious interpretation of this term is that the work is intended as the sequel to the philosophical fragments and is thus intended to conclude or complete that work. But there's also a deeper biographical explanation. As we know, all of Kierkegaard's siblings, with the exception of his elder brother, died a premature death. Needless to say, this had a profound effect on him. He developed the idea that he too would die before he reached the age of 34. In his recollections of Kirkegaard, Hans Bruckner records this when he writes, quote, "Kierkegaard once told me that as a young man, he had for many years had a firm conviction that he would die when he reached the age of 33. Was it Jesus' age that was also to be the norm for Jesus' imitator? Here, Bruckner himself seems a bit uncertain about why Kirkegaard thought he would die at exactly the age of 33, but speculates that since this was the age of Jesus at his death, this was one aspect of Jesus' life that Kirkegaard associated with his own. When he reached the age of 34, still alive and well, Kirkegaard could not bring himself to believe it, and even checked the official registry to see if the date of his birth had been recorded correctly. In any case, this meant that as Kirkegaard was writing his famous works, he always had in the back of his mind that he only had a few years left to live. He thus strategically planned his works in such a way that they would culminate in one final work, which would be the concluding unscientific postscript. This would be the work that brought together the different strands of his authorship. Since Kirkegaard believed that he would die after the publication of the postscript in 1846, he decided to make a statement about his works as a whole at the end of the book, presumably thinking that this would be his last chance to do so. Once he had completed the book, he then added at the very end a final section entitled A First and Last Explanation. This seems to have been almost an afterthought, since it appears on unnumbered pages, which also seems to separate this final text from the body of the concluding unscientific postscript. Throughout the years prior to this, Kirkegaard had been meticulous about keeping up the facade of the pseudonymous authors that he had created. He went to great lengths to distance himself from his works and to see to it that they were attributed to the fictional authors. As we've seen, when Heiberg criticized either or, Kirkegaard responded in an article, Public Confession, not in his own name, but in the name of the pseudonymous editor of the work, Victor Eremita. Kirkegaard was assisted in this attempt to present the pseudonyms as real authors by the literary customs of the day. In Golden Age Denmark, there was nothing new or original about writing in pseudonyms, and many of the great figures of the day also made use of them. Scholarly etiquette of the time dictated that as a reader or critic, one respect the pseudonym and not betray that one knew who the actual author was. Thus, in Heiberg's criticism of either or, he's careful never to mention Kirkegaard by name. Now here, in A First and Last Explanation, Kirkegaard takes an extraordinary and unprecedented step. He reveals that he's the author of the series of pseudonymous works leading up to and including the postscript itself. It seems on the face of it that his main goal was just to make it known that he was the author of Either Or, Fear and Trembling, and so forth, if he should die and people didn't know. In this sense, it seems in many ways natural that he would want to take credit for his work of so many years. But the matter's not quite so straightforward, since once he states this, he goes on to make a request of his readers, namely, that when they refer to a work, they attribute it not to him, but to the pseudonymous author. So while Kirkegaard claims legal responsibility for the pseudonymous works, he seems to want to maintain a distance relation to them, which was clearly a part of the original plan with the pseudonyms in the first place. In 1848, that is 2 years after the publication of the concluding unscientific postscript, Kirkegaard wrote a retrospective overview of his works entitled The Point of View for My Work as an Author. He only decided to publish a short version of this in 1850 under the title On My Work as an Author. But when the point of view was discovered among his manuscripts after his death, his brother Peter Christian Kirkegaard published it for his deceased brother in 1859. In these works, Kirkegaard reflects on his many books and their different relations to one another. In an entry from his journal NB10 from 1849, the same period, Kirkegaard indicates that his entire literary production is to be understood as a, quote, unified project. He refers to what he calls a, quote, comprehensive plan in the entire production. This is surprising to some readers, since we know that Kirkegaard was an outspoken critic of any form of systematic thinking. What could this then possibly mean when he seems to regard his collective literary work as a kind of unified system? This is what's explained in The Point of View. We know that Kirkegaard published works both under different pseudonyms and under his own name. The pseudonymous works treat different themes such as aesthetics, philosophy, and psychology, while the signed works tend to be more religious. Indeed, the signed works were primarily edifying or upbuilding discourses, which is a genre closely akin to sermons. It might further be claimed that the pseudonymous works were aimed at a more sophisticated audience, since they at times refer to academic debates and quote in foreign languages. By contrast, the edifying works seem to be directed to the common believer, who doesn't necessarily have any scholarly training. Kirkegaard's strategy, therefore, seems to have been to try to reach different kinds of people through his writings in a way that was most suitable to them. This meant that he had to write and present the material in different ways to different people. In the point of view from my work as an author, Kirkegaard explains that he intended for the two sets of works to run parallel with one another and to complement and supplement each other. So the idea was that for each pseudonymous work that he would publish, there would also appear a signed work parallel to it. In this way, two different authorships would arise together. Kirkegaard refers to the pseudonymous works as the, quote, aesthetic authorship, and the signed works as the religious authorship. Although it's clear that the pseudonymous works, such as Fear and Trembling, Philosophical Fragments, and The Concept of Anxiety, also treat religious subjects. When one looks at the publication dates of Kirkegaard's works, this conception of his authorship does, for the most part, seem to hold true. Either War was published on February the 20th, 1843, and its pendant, Two Upbuilding Discourses, was published only a couple months later on May the 16th, 1843. Similarly, the pseudonymous works Fear and Trembling and Repetition were published on October the 16th, 1843, and on exactly the same day, the signed collection, Three Upbuilding Discourses, appeared. One can continue to follow these parallels up to the publication of the concluding unscientific postscript in 1846. Kirkegaard thus created two authorships, side by side. This scheme also shows the importance of the concluding unscientific postscript. As we've seen, it was originally conceived to be Kirkegaard's final culminating work, since he was afraid that he would die thereafter. It also seems to be conceived as the work that brings together the two different strands of the authorship. In the point of view, Kirkegaard writes, quote, "The first division of books is aesthetic writing. The last division of books is exclusively religious writing. Between these lies the concluding unscientific postscript as the turning point." What does Kirkegaard mean by calling the postscript the turning point in his literary work? Kirkegaard didn't die as he expected in 1846, and he found that he couldn't stop writing after the postscript. So he continued his authorship, in a sense, starting again anew after the postscript. But the nature of his works after the postscript is, it's claimed, somewhat different. For this reason, scholars tend to divide Kirkegaard's life and work into two main parts. The first part of the authorship, which includes everything from Kirkegaard's initial articles in his first books up until the postscript in 1846, and the second half of the authorship, which includes everything after the postscript and culminates in Kirkegaard's attack on the church and his death in 1855. It's said that while the first half of the authorship gave primacy to the pseudonymous aesthetic works, the second half inverted this, putting the primary focus on the religious writings. A parallel shift can also be discerned in Kirkegaard's journals. Kirkegaard was an avid journal writer, and he meticulously kept running journals throughout his lifetime. He would buy at the stationery store bound notebooks with blank pages that he would use to write his journals in. People often think of his journals as a kind of personal diary, but this is somewhat misleading, since Kirkegaard used his journals for many other functions beyond simply recording the events of his daily life. Indeed, he used these journals for quite different purposes: to jot down a clever turn of phrase or thought, to note something interesting that he had just read, to record something that he could come back to and use in his later writings. The journals also fall into two large categories that correspond temporally with the two periods of the authorship. The first set of journals was given double numbers, AA, BB, CC, and so forth until KK. Kirkegaard began his first journal, AA, in 1835 when he was still a student at the University of Copenhagen, and he continued to write in his journal JJ into the year 1846. At the same time as these early journals, Kirkegaard also wrote a series of notebooks, simply numbered sequentially, that is, Notebook 1, Notebook 2, and so forth until Notebook 15. It's here that we find, for example, his lecture notes to Schelling's lectures and notes to his other readings. When Kirkegaard saw that he didn't die as he had anticipated, but he also continued to write journals. After he thought that he had given his definitive statement of his authorship in a first and last explanation, as time went on, he still felt the need to say more, and so he named his next journal, that he began immediately after the publication of the postscript, the NB Journal. The initials NB stand for the Latin words nota bene, or note well. The idea seems to be that these are supplemental remarks or reflections about his authorship. Even into 1847, Kirkegaard was still unsure about whether or not he was going to die, and so he continued to write in the journal named NB, which grew to be very large. At some point, he realized that he was in fact going to live, and so he continued with a new journal, which he called NB2. He continued the sequence of the NB journals until his death, with the final journal being NB36. The NB journals run parallel to the second half of the authorship and are somewhat different in character from the early journals. While the early journals contain very diverse kinds of material and skip from topic to topic very quickly, the NB journals display a greater degree of continuity. Indeed, they contain endless reflections on Kirkegaard's self-understanding and his complicated relations to others. In any case, the journals constitute a rich source of information about both Kirkegaard's life and works and provide interesting perspectives that are not always afforded in his published writings. The early journals, AA to KK, and the NB journals respectively reflect the two large parts of Kirkegaard's authorship. At the beginning of this lecture, we noted that Kirkegaard made the strikingly odd claim that he believed that Socrates became a Christian. Now, after looking at some of Kirkegaard's important works from the years 1844 to 1846, we can perhaps begin to gain some insight into what he means by this. Usually we associate Christianity with a set of teachings, dogmas, and doctrines. If this is what Christianity is, then surely it can't make any sense to say that Socrates was a Christian or could have become one, since he was never familiar with these teachings and had no way of ascribing to them. But as we've seen, Kirkegaard, through his pseudonymous authors, seems to believe that this is not the true essence of Christianity. To his mind, it's a mistake to think of Christianity as a set of dogmas or doctrines. This is the conception of Christianity that theologians, philosophers, and other kinds of scholars tend to have, but Kirkegaard is consistently critical of these kinds of people. He believes that their conception of Christianity is misguided and even corrupt. What then is Kirkegaard's conception of Christianity, and what does this have to do with Socrates? This is not so easy to identify or to describe clearly, since Kirkegaard seems very intent on avoiding giving us, his readers, any easy definitions or positive statements in this regard. But we can gain a glimpse of this if we recall the different analyses that we examined in this lecture. Kirkegaard's different authors claim consistently that Christianity is concerned with the inwardness of each and every individual. It's about the passion of the individual in the face of certain ideas that are paradoxical, absurd, and contradictory. This is just the opposite of the conception of Christianity of the scholars of the day, who try to understand and explain the paradox and the absurdity of the key dogmas. But for Kirkegaard, Christianity is all about accepting these in inwardness and passion and not trying to understand and comprehend them. Kirkegaard believes that Socrates can play an important negative role here. With Socrates' critical disposition, he can help us to undermine the different positive doctrines about Christianity. He can help us to return to the paradox, the absurdity, and the contradiction that's intrinsic to Christianity. So if we regard Christianity not as a positive set of doctrines and teachings, but rather as a certain inward disposition that focuses on the individual subject, then we can start to make some sense about why Kirkegaard believes he can associate the pagan Socrates with Christianity. Now, needless to say, this is all very provocative and controversial. Let's together try to evaluate the strengths and the weaknesses of this view and see to what degree it accords with our own modern intuitions. On the one hand, Kierkegaard's view of Christianity as something that's fundamentally tied to the individual subject is highly attractive to many people today. There seems to be something intuitively correct about focusing on the inwardness and subjectivity of the individual when we're talking about Christianity, or indeed religion in general. There's also something attractive about the view that one can believe in the inwardness of one's own heart, but not have to convince anyone else about it. Indeed, on Kierkegaard's view, it would be a mistake to try to convince other people of the truth of Christianity, since this would distort its inward nature. Each individual must come to Christian faith on their own. The most that another person can do is to be an occasion for this, but they can't bring about faith in another person with arguments or other forms of persuasion. On the other hand, there's something a bit unsettling about the radicality of Kierkegaard's emphasis on the subjectivity of the individual. Some people have worried that Kierkegaard opens the door for subjectivity and relativism. If the truth of Christianity is just about my inwardness and my subjective passion, then is there any real connection to any objective truth? Indeed, in the history of the Christian religion, people have always thought that the truth of Christianity is dependent on certain things. For example, that God became flesh and came into the world as a human being, or that Jesus performed miracles and that he returned to life after being crucified. The usual assumption has always been that if these things are not true, then this would undermine the truth of Christianity. And it doesn't really matter what I might think about this personally in my own inwardness or passion. For this reason, critics of Christianity have always attacked these kinds of things to show that they're not credible. But by locating faith in the inwardness of the individual, some people have argued that Kierkegaard neglects this other objective dimension of Christianity. Doesn't being a Christian mean having a relation to these outward objective things? Can one really be a Christian merely by focusing on one's inwardness and ignoring all these things that have traditionally been associated with Christianity? The point here is not to praise or to criticize Kierkegaard's views, but rather to understand them and to fully appreciate their radicality. He raises absolutely basic issues for all of us, even if one's not a Christian or even if one's not particularly religious. He raises the fundamental question that goes back to Socrates. What is the truth? Is it something that's out there in the world, a fact of the matter? When I look out and say that here and now the sun is shining, isn't this true independent of my subjective disposition? Aren't there things like this that are objectively true and that I can give arguments and reasons to support as true? The Earth is the third planet from the sun. A molecule of water contains 1 oxygen atom and 2 hydrogen atoms. 2 plus 3 are equal to 5. Isn't the truth something that's objective and greater than the personal opinions or dispositions of individuals who might well be confused, mistaken, or deceived? Or is the truth something subjective, something in me? When I read a poem or view a painting, hear a piece of music, I get a feeling that I can't necessarily describe or articulate it in words, but that I'm somehow certain about, even if other people disagree with me. I'm convinced that the poem or the painting or the song captures something true and beautiful, even if no one else seems to think so. Or in ethics, I might have a deep-seated conviction that I owe my friend something, even if other people, or even my friend himself, might not think so. I alone feel convinced of this. When I'm listening to a sermon or reading a sacred text, I might have the feeling of having a personal and special relationship to God, or of a deep conviction of the truth of religion, even if other people might regard me as silly, old-fashioned, or superstitious. I can't point to anything in the world to demonstrate the truth of these things, but I just seem to know them to be true in my own heart. Isn't the truth in these important areas something subjective and inward, as Kirkegaard says? In the modern world, for many people, our intuitions are caught somewhere between these two views. Is the truth something objective, or is the truth something subjective? The last decade of Kirkegaard's life was in many ways the most dramatic. This was the time of the Revolution of 1848 and of Kirkegaard's public attack on the Danish state church in the final years of his life. As we saw in the last lecture, this period represents what Kirkegaard scholars refer to as the second half of the authorship, namely the period from 1846, after the concluding unscientific postscript, to Kirkegaard's death in 1855. In this lecture, we want to explore some of Kirkegaard's main works from these years, works such as A Literary Review of Two Ages, Upbuilding Discourses in Various Spirits, The Sickness unto Death, Practice in Christianity, and The Moment. We'll see how some of the themes and motifs that we've examined so far reappear in these works. In our exploration of these texts, it will be evident that even as Kirkegaard grows older, he continues to return to the figure of Socrates as a source of inspiration. Indeed, he never abandons the great hero of his youth. Even in the last text that he never completed before his death, he explicitly states that Socrates was the only model that he used for his work. Our goal in the lecture today is, among other things, to try to understand what he means by this. Although Kirkegaard believed that he was going to die and that the concluding unscientific postscript would be his final work, he continued to live and could not help but to continue writing. Only a month after the postscript, on March the 30th, 1846, he published a work called A Literary Review of Two Ages. This short work is a review of a novel by Thomasine Gullenberg, the mother of Johann Ludwig Heiberg. The novel is entitled Two Ages. Gullenberg's work contrasts two historical periods. One, the period of Romanticism in the Napoleonic era, and the other, the period of the Restoration. This contrast is portrayed in the story of a couple of different generations of a family living in Copenhagen. Kirkegaard seizes on this novel to develop some of his own ideas about society. Scholars often point to this work as Kirkegaard's most important statement of social-political thought. It can't really be said that Kirkegaard was a major figure in the field of social-political philosophy in the way that one can talk about figures such as John Locke, Karl Marx, or John Stuart Mill. Kirkegaard never wrote any extensive treatise on political philosophy, and his A Literary Review of Two Ages can hardly be compared with the classics of political philosophy, such as Locke's Second Treatise of Government or Rousseau's The Social Contract. In some ways, Kirkegaard doesn't appear to have been much interested in politics due to his strong emphasis on the inward religious nature of the individual. This emphasis seems in many ways to undermine a social or political theory. But with that said, there can be no doubt that Kirkegaard does have some important insights that can be used in the context of social political philosophy. One of these is the concept of leveling. This is an important idea that Kirkegaard explores in A Literary Review. Kirkegaard was at heart a royalist, and he was wary of the changes that were beginning to take place and that would culminate in the Revolution of 1848. He believed that it was beneficial for society to be organized in a way that the differences of individuals be recognized. This is, in a sense, the case with a society with rigid social classes, since individuals are more or less immediately recognized as a member of one class or another. But the fundamental idea of democracy is that everyone has the same rights to vote and to have their say in how the government should be run. Kirkegaard was worried about this development since he feared that this would create a public opinion that would be grounded in the masses. Thus, public opinion would undermine the individuality of everyone, since it would be a projection of a larger group. The concept of leveling appears in this context. Kirkegaard was concerned that the rush towards democracy would work against anyone who dared to stand out from the crowd in any way. Public opinion encourages people to be conformist. No one wants to appear different from anyone else. If one does, then public opinion will turn against such a person and expose him or her to ridicule. This was the way that Kirkegaard understood what happened to him in connection with his polemical exchange with the journal The Corsair. He believed himself to be unfairly persecuted by the Corsair, which managed to turn the general public opinion against him. Kirkegaard believes that this kind of phenomenon is a pernicious aspect of modern life. Anyone who dares to be different or who possesses great gifts that make the mediocre masses envious will be subject to criticism and mockery. Such a person who towers above others will be brought down to the common level of the masses. This is what Kirkegaard understands by leveling. Instead of encouraging people to cultivate and develop their individual genius, modern democratic culture actively undermines and works against this. In this regard, he believes that the old order of things was better, where recognition was given to, for example, nobility, and the public opinion did not carry so much weight. In that world, it was easier for people to stand out without being subject to the persecution of the masses in public opinion. Although Kirkegaard was a royalist, he had a reserved relation to the king himself. At the time, the King of Denmark was Christian VIII, who ruled since 1839. The king and his wife were interested in Kirkegaard, and the king thus summoned him to a series of 3 audiences. Kierkegaard's first audience took place here, at Amalienborg Palace on March the 13th, 1847. Kierkegaard records these encounters in his journal NB9. It seems that the king was interested in using Kierkegaard as a kind of advisor in affairs concerning intellectual life in the kingdom. He had heard that Kierkegaard had been in Berlin and had attended Schelling's lectures and was interested to hear about Schelling's role in the political developments in Prussia. As we discussed in Lecture 6, Schelling had been appointed by the King of Prussia explicitly to combat what were regarded as the negative progressive influences of left Hegelianism. Many of Hegel's students became active politically and came to play an important role in the revolutions of 1848. Christian VIII was presumably interested to hear if the appointment of the conservative Schelling had managed to stem this development, which was of course perceived as a direct threat to the monarchy. Christian VIII was also interested in appointing Kirkegaard to an academic position at the Suru Academy, presumably with a similar strategic idea in mind. But Kirkegaard refused to be drawn into politics in this way. Indeed, he was reluctant even to meet the king and was fearful of any closer contacts with him. For example, when the king made it known that he wanted to see him, Kirkegaard initially used as an excuse that he did not have suitable attire and could not come. But the king insisted, and Kirkegaard was obliged to visit the palace. During their discussion, the king, without asking Kirkegaard, simply informed his servants that Kirkegaard would be staying for dinner. For most people, this would of course be regarded as a great honor, but Kirkegaard rather brazenly refused, insisting that it was simply impossible for him to stay for dinner. When the king continued to make overtures to Kirkegaard, inviting him to a closer contact, Kirkegaard simply stated that he was a private person, thus implying that such a contact was not desirable for him. So, while we can say that politically speaking Kirkegaard was a royalist, this statement should be qualified. Kirkegaard did not have an uncritical disposition towards royal power or nobility, and he enjoyed making fun of people who held high positions and enjoyed noble titles. While it's true that he was deeply worried about the democratic developments that led to the revolution of 1848, he did not want to be drawn into any direct political role. He wanted to keep his primary focus on the inward life of the individual. In the years following the publication of the concluding unscientific postscript and a literary review, Kirkegaard continued to publish prolifically. While we can't look at all these works in great detail, we can at least mention them briefly. In 1847, Kirkegaard published two major works in his own name. First, Upbuilding Discourses in Various Spirits, and then Works of Love. In these works, Kirkegaard refers to Socrates not by name, but rather as the simple wise man of antiquity and the simple wise man of old. In Upbuilding Discourses in Various Spirits, Socrates is held up as a positive contrast to what Kirkegaard calls the crowd. As we've just seen, Kirkegaard was concerned about the political ferment taking place at the time where people were demanding democratic reform. In a democracy, what's important is the voice of the majority, and so in politics, it's natural that one try to discuss policies with others and thus build a consensus. Kirkegaard has a negative view of the idea of people as a collective unit, such as a political party, a political lobby or interest group, or political opinion. He believes that this distorts or even destroys the voice of the individual. One dares not oppose the voice of the majority for fear of being subject to its criticism. For this reason, Kirkegaard hails Socrates, who stubbornly insisted on the individual. The truth is to be found in each particular person, not in the collective group. On May the 18th, 1851, Kirkegaard gave a sermon here at the Citadel Church. The theme of the sermon was the letter of James, chapter 1, verses 17 to 21, where God is referred to as, quote, the Father of lights, with whom there is no change or shadow of variation. Kirkegaard later published this as a discourse entitled The Changelessness of God. In Works of Love, a book that Kirkegaard published in his own name, he attempts to develop a theory of Christian love. Here he explores in some detail the meaning of the biblical command to love one's neighbor. In one passage, he tries to compare Socrates' practice with Christian love. He claims that true love is to help the other person to be free, to stand on their own. Socrates does this with his questioning. The goal of the Socratic method is to show the interlocutor that, in fact, he doesn't know the things he thought he knew. Thus, the view of the other persons are reduced to absurdities and contradictions. Socrates attempts to show this not by telling the other person what the truth is, but rather by extracting it from the other person by means of his questioning. As we learn, this is what Socrates refers to as his art of midwifery or maieutic. In this way, Socrates can claim that he wasn't the author of any new knowledge or information, but rather merely assisted in its coming to the world, just like a midwife assists in delivering babies. Kirkegaard emphasizes the point here that while Socrates is helping the other person in this way, he must remain as unselfish and as anonymous as possible. Indeed, this can even be conceived as an act of self-sacrifice on the part of Socrates, who's helping others in this way, even though it often leads to them being angry with him. No one likes discovering that the things they hold to be true are in fact confused and mistaken, and the sense of humiliation that this causes was the source of great hostility against Socrates in ancient Athens. For this reason, Socrates can't make a great show of helping other people, but instead must play down his own role and play up the fact that the other person is reaching the truth on their own. Kirkegaard refers to this in a somewhat odd way as, quote, deceiving the other into the truth. What he means by this is that Socrates' interlocutor doesn't really know what's happening when he's talking with Socrates. He doesn't really realize that Socrates is helping him by eliminating his false beliefs and illusions and leading him to stand on his own feet afterwards. In the end, he has Socrates to thank for being free, but he's unaware of this. This seems clearly to be the model for Kirkegaard for what he's doing with his own writings. On the negative side, he's combating what he takes to be the mistaken conceptions of Christianity that come from the church, academic theologians and philosophers, or mainstream culture generally. Then, on the positive side, he, just like Socrates, the midwife, is enjoining each individual to find their own individual way to the Christian truth. In this way, he believes that he's helping other people to stand on their own and to be free. On April the 26th, 1848, Kirkegaard published Christian Discourses. In this work, he takes specific biblical passages and expounds on them. In a couple of places, in part 3 of the text, he refers to Socrates, as before, as the simple wise man of antiquity. Again, it's striking that Kirkegaard makes use of Socrates, a pagan philosopher, in the context of a Christian work that attempts an exegesis of parts of the Bible. At the end of July of 1848, Kirkegaard published an extended article with the title, "The Crisis and the Crisis in the Life of an Actress." This work examines the acting of the most celebrated actress of the age, Johanna Luisa Heiberg, who was the wife of the poet, critic, and philosopher Johann Ludwig Heiberg. In Kirkegaard's article, he explores the actress's portrayal of the character of Juliet from Shakespeare's famous tragedy, Romeo and Juliet. She had played this role at the age of 15, and then again at the age of 35. Kirkegaard investigates what this means for the artistic rendering of the character. His account is highly flattering to Johanna Luisa Heiberg's skills as an actress. He praises her nuanced portrayal of Juliet, even though she was 2 decades older than the character she was playing. In 1849, he published The Lily in the Field and the Bird of the Air, and 3 discourses at the Communion on Fridays, both in his own name, along with 2 ethical religious essays and The Sickness unto Death under pseudonyms. Kirkegaard's productivity continued to be astonishing, and all the while one can see the figure of Socrates in the background of works, even works where one would not expect it. In the last lecture, we mentioned Kirkegaard's posthumously published book, The Point of View for My Work as an Author. This work is a highly insightful one with regard to how Kirkegaard conceived of individual works and his mission as an author in general. Of particular importance in our context is the fact that he refers to Socrates several times and makes it clear that he's following the Greek philosopher in certain aspects. For example, in the introduction to the work, Kirkegaard explains to the reader that the point of view is not a defense of his writings, and he compares this with Socrates' behavior at his trial. He writes, "If in nothing else on this point, I truly believe I have something in common with Socrates." He recalls that at the end of his trial, Socrates mentions that his daimon never tried to prevent him or stop him from speaking or acting in the way he did at his trial. And so Socrates took this to mean that he was in no danger, since if he were doing something wrong, his daimon would have warned him, as it always did. Kirkegaard interprets this to mean that at his trial, Socrates never really tried to defend himself, or rather, that his divine daimon had prevented him from defending himself. Kirkegaard believes that such a defense would have been a contradiction, presumably since Socrates' work was always negative, and to defend himself would have amounted to stating positive claims. One can discuss the validity of Kirkegaard's interpretation here, since it does indeed seem that Socrates tries to explain and thus defend his actions to the jurors. But then, in Kirkegaard's favor is the fact that when Socrates had the opportunity to propose an alternative sentence, he didn't really make any serious attempt to get a lighter punishment, but rather proposed that he receive free meals at the Prytaneum. In any case, Kirkegaard draws the parallel, just as Socrates refused to defend himself, quote, "So also there is in me, and in the dialectical nature of my relationship, something that makes it impossible for me and impossible in itself to conduct a defense of my authorship." So on this score, it seems that Kirkegaard clearly identified with the fate of Socrates and regarded himself to be persecuted unjustly by what he called the crowd. Moreover, he followed the model of Socrates by refusing to give any straightforward defense of his works. In another passage, Kirkegaard is disturbed by the rising demands for democracy, which he believes in some ways destroys the individual. In democracy, what's important is not the individual as individual, but rather the collection of people in larger groups, that is, in political parties. One's voice as an individual is only heard when the voice is shared by a number of other voices. Thus, Kierkegaard develops a number of concepts, such as the crowd, the masses, public opinion, which he takes to be pernicious new developments in his own age. One of the main goals of his work is to point in just the opposite direction, namely, to the absolute irreducible value of the individual as individual. He believes that even if one has an opinion that's not shared by others, and thus is obliged to stand alone as an individual, this should be respected and should be regarded as something having validity. But in a democracy, it can never really have any weight until it's shared by a larger group. Also on this point, Kirkegaard believes that he shares something in common with Socrates. He explains how he developed the idea of the single individual, and that people found this notion somewhat eccentric. Kirkegaard then notes that Socrates, who also focused on the individual, was also regarded in his time as eccentric. Here Kirkegaard refers to Hegel's analysis of Socrates as the inventor of ethics, in the sense of being the inventor of the idea of subjective freedom. Kirkegaard thus sees himself as reintroducing this idea of subjective freedom in his own day. In the age of modern democracy, it's the crowd that's evil, and so he takes a part of his task to be to struggle against this tendency by focusing on the individual. In these reflections on his work, Kirkegaard reserves a special place for Socrates, whom he acknowledges as his teacher. This confirms that Kierkegaard's appreciation for Socrates was not just a fleeting youthful interest in his master's thesis, but rather was an absolutely determining factor in his work as a whole. So it was here in this building where Kierkegaard wrote The Sickness Unto Death. You can see the plaque up on the wall that indicates that this is where he lived during this time. The Sickness Unto Death was published on July 30th, 1849. That is just a month or so after the introduction of the new Danish Constitution, and with this, the completion of the bloodless revolution. In the year 1848, there were revolutions breaking out across Europe. People protested against the rule of absolute monarchy and demanded that the power of the kings be limited by a constitution. The revolution began in France and quickly spread to include the German states, the Italian states, the Habsburg Empire, Poland, Belgium, Romania, and so on. There was also a revolution here in Denmark. On March 21st, 1848, the National Liberals marched to the royal palace and demanded that the new king, Frederick VII, create a new democratic constitution. The king agreed, and the work was begun on a new constitution that would limit the rights of the royalty and nobility and would mark the beginning of a new political order. These negotiations went on for more than a year until the new constitution was agreed upon and signed into law on June the 5th, 1849. This was the most radical period of political change in Europe since the French Revolution of 1789. The Sickness Unto Death is known for its analysis of the concept of despair. Kierkegaard introduces a new pseudonymous author by the name of Anticlimacus, who catalogs the different forms of despair that humans suffer from. He tries to understand despair as a form of sin, and in the end points to embracing Christianity as the solution to despair. Although one might think that this work is irrelevant for Kierkegaard's concerns with Socrates, in fact, Anticlimacus also holds up Socrates as a model for what's needed in his own day. In a short section, Anticlimacus compares Socrates' understanding of sin with the Christian understanding. The discussion of Socrates has to be seen against the background of the political turmoil that was taking place in Denmark at the time. In the course of the negotiations in the Constitutional Assembly, there were, of course, many different voices which argued for the introduction of different rights and the abolition of the old privileges. Each person seemed to have his or her own clear idea about what was needed at the time. In The Sickness Unto Death, Kierkegaard refers to this in a somewhat odd way. He doesn't evoke some particular political leader or political party or modern cause, but instead he harkens back to Socrates. He writes, quote, "Socrates, Socrates, Socrates. Yes, we may call your name 3 times. It would not even be too much to call it 10 times if it would be of any help. Popular opinion maintains that the world needs a republic, needs a new social order, and a new religion. But no one considers that what the world, confused simply by too much knowledge, needs is Socrates." What could Kirkegaard possibly have meant by this? Why would he think that of all the people, the ancient philosopher Socrates was of urgent importance in the wake of the 1848 revolutions in Europe? Kirkegaard suggests that what his age needs is what he calls an ironic ethical correction. This is what Socrates provided for his Greek contemporaries. Socrates corrected the folly of his fellow countrymen by his irony, by claiming to know nothing and pretending to believe that other people knew all the things that they said that they did. In Kierkegaard's time, people were quite convinced that they knew what was needed for the state. They each had their own idea of the nature of the Constitution or the structure of the government. Kierkegaard seems to suggest that they're really misguided and that they don't really know. And so what's needed is for someone to show that they don't know by means of some modern version of Socratic irony. He notes that people are anxious to go beyond Socrates and to construct some positive doctrine or present some concrete solution to the political confusion of the day. But he claims, instead of overcoming Socratic ignorance and going beyond Socrates, what's needed rather is a return to Socrates, that is, a return to Socratic ignorance. In this context, he talks about the attempts of philosophers and theologians to explain and understand Christianity. Now, as we've seen, his goal is to point out that Christianity can't be explained or understood discursively since it's based on a paradox, an absurdity, or a contradiction. So to attempt to comprehend it can only serve to distort its true nature. Kirkegaard thus writes, I quote, "I consider it an outright ethical task, perhaps requiring not a very little self-denial in these very speculative times, when all the others are busy comprehending Christianity, to admit that one is neither able nor obliged to comprehend it. Precisely this is no doubt what our age, what Christendom needs, a little Socratic ignorance with respect to Christianity." So Socrates is thus held up as a corrective to the errors of 19th century philosophy and theology. Socratic ignorance is the means to correct the mistaken conceptions of Christianity. Kirkegaard recalls that Socrates' claim to ignorance and his ironic questioning of his fellow citizens were a part of what Socrates regarded as a divine command. Socrates believed that by the oracle saying that he was the wisest, he'd been enjoined to examine the purported wisdom of others and undermine it when it proved to be unfounded. Kirkegaard regards his own mission as a parallel one with that of Socrates. But instead of the issue of being one of knowledge, it's one of the nature of Christianity. Kirkegaard goes around Copenhagen and explores the different conceptions of Christianity which he believes to be mistaken. In his works, he tries to point out the contradictions and problems with these conceptions in order to undermine them, just as Socrates did with the different claims to knowledge that he encountered. But Kirkegaard resists the urge to prop up a different positive conception of Christianity in contrast to the ones he's criticizing, just as Socrates refuses to present any positive doctrine of the truth itself. Instead, they're both content to remain in negativity. Kirkegaard thus uses Socratic ignorance to guard Christianity against the mistaken positive claims of philosophy and theology of his own day. In 1850, Kirkegaard published the work Practicing Christianity under the pseudonym Anticlimacus, the same pseudonym that he used for the author of The Sickness Unto Death. The work is divided into 3 sections or numbers. The first of these treats the passage from Matthew chapter 11, verse 28, where Jesus says, "Come here, all you who labor and are burdened, and I will give you rest." Kirkegaard had previously given a sermon on this passage here in the Church of Our Lady for the Friday Communion on June 18th, 1847. He then published this in 1848 as in part 4 of Christian Discourses. A part of Kierkegaard's inspiration for this analysis might well have come from this sculpture of Jesus by the famous Danish sculptor Bertel Thorvaldsen. The statue stands here at the altar of the Church of Our Lady. In the second part of the work, Kierkegaard draws attention to another passage in Matthew, namely chapter 11, verse 6. Jesus says, "Blessed is he who is not offended in me." Why does Kirkegaard take this to be such an important passage? Through his pseudonymous author, he tries to bring us back to the time of Jesus and to capture the experience of the people who saw him and heard him preach. He points out that they didn't see a God, but rather a humble man. There was nothing triumphant about Jesus as he was going around the countryside with his flock of disciples spreading his message. Most importantly, Kierkegaard emphasizes that many people were offended by the idea that Jesus was the Son of God and the Savior. They couldn't reconcile this with his humble and meek appearance. So instead of believing, they were offended by the idea. Kierkegaard's point here is that this is an important and essential part of Christian belief that we can't forget if we hope to maintain a veridical picture of Christian faith. In short, we must maintain what Kierkegaard calls the possibility of offense. When Jesus is portrayed as a powerful and triumphant figure, this is a distortion of the historical Jesus. This is not what his contemporary followers saw, but yet they chose to believe anyway. In other words, many more people would presumably have believed right away if they could immediately see that Christ was a powerful, superhuman figure. Such portrayals, however, eliminate the possibility of offense, since no one would be offended at the idea of a triumphant, powerful figure being regarded as a savior or Son of God. But this constitutes a misunderstanding and distorts the nature of faith. Kierkegaard's point is that we must be like the contemporaries of Jesus and believe in spite of his humble appearance. We must believe even though others are offended. But if there's no possibility of offense, then there's no belief. In connection with this, in part 2 of the work, Kierkegaard refers to Christ as what he calls a sign of contradiction. He explains that the idea of Christ as both human and divine, or as the God-man, is a sign of contradiction. In other words, our common sense tells us that something must be one thing or the other. We can well understand the idea of a God and the idea of a human being, but the idea of both together is a contradiction. The fundamental idea of Christianity is thus something that's contrary to our understanding. Kierkegaard's claim is that this contradiction needs to be maintained, since this is what is required for faith. Kierkegaard departs from the long tradition of Christian apologetics, which tries to make the idea of the double nature of Christ more comprehensible and understandable. Such attempts have traditionally been made in defense of Christianity. Their goal is to make it easier to understand this key Christian doctrine. But Kierkegaard stubbornly insists that this is a mistake. True Christian faith involves not explaining or dissolving this difficulty, but rather cultivating it and emphasizing it. Here we can again see the influence of Socrates on Kierkegaard's project. With ideas such as offense or the sign of contradiction, one can see that his goal is not to make faith easier, but rather more difficult. These are not positive doctrines that explain things, rather they're negative. They show us the limits of our understanding and our explanations. So just as Socrates questioned people and made knowing more difficult by exposing the mistaken views of his interlocutors, so also Kierkegaard makes Christian faith more difficult by exposing the mistaken conceptions of Christian faith. But Kierkegaard's Socrates says that he himself is ignorant and doesn't present a solution to the problem. So also Kierkegaard, through his pseudonyms, doesn't present a solution by giving his own theory of the incarnation or the nature of Jesus. Instead, he simply says that it is a contradiction that can't be grasped by the understanding and leaves it at that. During the last years of his life, 1854 to 1855, Kirkegaard mounted an unforgiving attack on the Danish state church and its most distinguished representatives. He issued his attack in a series of polemical articles in the newspaper The Fatherland and in his own pamphlet, which he called The Moment. He violently criticized the priests and bishops of corruption, hypocrisy, and distorting the Christian message. This attack was scandalous for Danish society, and even years after Kirkegaard's death, it was considered impolite even to mention it. What was Kirkegaard so upset about? The immediate occasion for Kirkegaard's attack was a sermon that was given by his old rival, Hans Lassen Martensen, who had just been appointed as Bishop of Sealand and the head of the Danish state church. In his sermon, Martensen referred to his predecessor, the recently deceased Jacob Peter Münster, as a witness to the truth. This outraged Kirkegaard, and he wrote an article entitled, "Was Bishop Münster a Truth Witness?" which he published on December the 18th, 1854, in the journal The Fatherland. This is the occasion for Kirkegaard to develop his conception of what he calls New Testament Christianity, and to show how radically it differs from the lives of Münster and Martensen. This is the Church of Our Lady, the church where both Münster and Martensen served as Bishop of Sealand and head of the Danish state church. By New Testament Christianity, Kirkegaard seems to mean the form of Christianity that was practiced by its first followers as recorded in the New Testament. He points out that Christianity at that time, when the religion was just being born and starting to spread in the world, was a very difficult kind of faith. The early Christians lived in poverty and were ridiculed and detested by the mainstream Roman society. Kirkegaard emphasizes that back then, Christians were very often martyrs for their faith. They were subject to persecution, ridicule, and humiliation. They lost their jobs, their property, and indeed their lives. At that time, in the ancient Roman world, to stand up and say, "I am a Christian," was to risk one's life. Christians had to meet in secret to hold their church services. In the face of this, belief was a very difficult matter. One had to believe in the divinity of Christ, which, according to Kirkegaard, is, even on its own terms, by no means an obvious or straightforward matter. And this in the face of great negative external pressure from the surrounding society, often including one's own family and friends. Thus, for Kirkegaard, the true Christian is a witness to the truth of Christianity in the way that he or she is prepared to be persecuted, tortured, and suffer for their belief. He sets a very high standard indeed. In this context, Kirkegaard sees Socrates as a parallel situation. The true Christian was one who had to be prepared for martyrdom, to be tortured and even killed for his beliefs. Socrates was, in a sense, a martyr for philosophy. Socrates unrelentingly sought the truth, even if it made him enemies. People came to resent him since he exposed them for their arrogance and ignorance. Even at the time, he never recanted or regretted his actions, but instead stuck steadfastly to his beliefs. This kind of resolve is needed for the true Christian to return to New Testament Christianity. Like Socrates, the person who, like Kirkegaard, exposes the hypocrisy and corruption of the clergy of the day will be exposed to ridicule and hatred. From the conflict with the Khazar, Kirkegaard learned what it was like to experience this, and he regarded himself as a martyr. He then compares this picture with what he sees in the Danish state church. He looks at the highest officials of the church and sees not martyrs, but rather well-fed, comfortable bourgeois citizens. They're in no danger of being persecuted. There's no chance that they will ever have to risk their lives. On the contrary, they're among the most respected members of society, and they receive a regular salary from the state. Kirkegaard argues that this is wholly inconsonant with the true nature of Christianity as one finds it in the New Testament. Instead of losing their living and their livelihood by being Christians, the priests are earning their living with it. Instead of being detested outcasts of society, the priests are the leading pillars of it. Kirkegaard believes that this is a fundamental distortion of the true nature of Christianity. He demands that the priests either reform themselves in order to come more in line with the hard demands of New Testament Christianity, or give up calling themselves Christians. Also at the individual level, Kirkegaard finds it absurd that one can be a Christian simply by virtue of the fact that one has been born into a Christian country. One is never asked about it, but one is automatically a member of the state church. This again is, according to Kirkegaard, not in keeping with the true nature of the Christian doctrine, which demands a conscious act of belief on the part of the individual. If no conscious choice has taken place, then one can't call oneself a Christian. With these views, Kirkegaard issues a very difficult challenge to his contemporaries and warns against religious complacency. To be a Christian is an infinitely difficult matter. It's something that one needs to work at every day and every hour. It requires one to make all sorts of sacrifices with regard to normal bourgeois life. His warning to the future was clearly for people to be attentive to this and to always keep in focus the difficult demands of New Testament Christianity and not to allow themselves to be seduced by a lukewarm version of it that is, to his mind, a grotesque distortion. While Kirkegaard was writing the articles for the Fatherland in the Moment, he lived here in this building across the street called Kirkegaard, right across from the Church of Our Lady in the Bishop's Palace. He was living literally just a stone's throw away from Bishop Martenson's residence. While he was here, he published 9 issues of The Moment and had just completed the 10th and final issue when he fell ill. So this was the last text that he ever completed in his life. The Moment number 10 is an interesting work since Kirkegaard reflects on his own strategy in his attack on the church. And here, once again, we can see some interesting hints of the figure of Socrates emerge. In the section called My Task, Kirkegaard reminds his readers that he's not called himself a Christian and that this is of the utmost importance that people bear in mind. This might come as a surprise to some people, since every introductory text or encyclopedia article on Kirkegaard begins by saying that he is a Christian writer. What then can he mean to say that he never called himself a Christian? In the history of the Christian church, there have always been different sects and factions which claimed to know about the truth of Christianity and criticized others for not knowing it. They thus took a kind of moral high ground by claiming to be the true Christians, while others fell short of the mark. Kirkegaard is anxious to avoid this kind of relation where he props himself up as the moral authority, claiming to be the true Christian and criticizing his enemies for being false Christians. If he were to assert that he were the true Christian, then he would open himself up to criticisms of his opponents, who could claim that he was a hypocrite. In order to avoid this, he simply says that he doesn't call himself a Christian. However, he paints a picture of New Testament Christianity that's so difficult to live up to that it ends up being a kind of ideal that no one can attain. This ideal allows him to criticize what he takes to be the corrupt and false Christianity of his contemporaries without him having to commit himself to saying that he personally embodies the idea. In short, the ideal does the critical work for him, and he simply has to point it out to people. This is similar to the strategy of Socrates, who never claims to know the truth. On the contrary, he claims to know nothing. He then goes around and asks others what they know, just as Kirkegaard explores the conception of Christianity of other people in Golden Age Copenhagen. Socrates then discovers that although other people claim to know certain things, they are in fact ignorant, just as Kirkegaard sees that although his contemporaries claim to be pious Christians, they have in fact a mistaken understanding of Christianity. Socrates, however, keeps driving at the truth and continues to ask people what they know in the hope of one day finding it. It's as if he has a conception or ideal of the truth that he can never manage to attain, just as Kirkegaard has an ideal of Christianity, but yet says that he does not call himself a Christian. Neither Socrates nor Kirkegaard claim that they have reached this ideal, but the critical part of their task demonstrates clearly that other people have not attained it either, even though these same people proudly boast that they have done so. Thus, Kirkegaard writes, The only analogy I have before me is Socrates. My task is a Socratic task, to audit the definition of what it is to be a Christian. I do not call myself a Christian, keeping the ideal free, but I can make it manifest that the others are that even less. This makes it clear that Kirkegaard used Socrates, a pagan philosopher, in his attempt to criticize what he took to be the mistaken conceptions about Christianity in his own time. When Socrates was confronted with the words of the oracle, that there was no one wiser than he interpreted this to mean simply that while everyone else claimed to know something, and yet was ignorant, he knew at least that he was ignorant, and on this sole point, he was wiser than the others. Similarly, Kirkegaard can point out that the version of Christianity that the others are following is mistaken, although everyone else believes that they are pious Christians. The difference between Kirkegaard and them is simply that he realizes that he's not a Christian, while the others continue to believe themselves to be so. Thus, like Socrates, he avoids making the positive claim about his own status, but instead, his project is the negative one of exposing the problems with the views of others. The analogy goes even further. Socrates struggled against the sophists in his own time. They taught for money, and they had no problem in presenting something as true. Kirkegaard sees a pendant to the sophists in his own day in the clergy and professors of theology. They too teach for a fee. Indeed, they're financially supported by the state. They claim to teach the truth of Christianity, but according to Kirkegaard, the conception of Christianity that they produce is deeply problematic. So for Kirkegaard, these are the modern sophists, while he is the modern Socrates. The public conflict with the Danish church doubtless took its toll on Kirkegaard, who never really enjoyed robust health, even in his best days. Perhaps due to stress and overwork, Kirkegaard became seriously ill and, after collapsing, was admitted to Frederiks Hospital on October the 2nd, 1855. Today, this is the Danish Museum for Design. Kirkegaard apparently suffered from a paralysis that immobilized his legs and lower body. His condition gradually worsened to the point that he could hardly hold up his head or even move on his own. He was visited regularly by some of the members of his extended family, for example, his nephews. But he refused to see his elder brother Peter Christian when he came to visit him. Kirkegaard was angry with his brother, who had given a speech at the Roskilde Ecclesiastical Convention on July the 5th, 1855, in which he took a critical stance toward Kirkegaard's attack on the church. Kirkegaard was, however, regularly visited by his friend Emil Buzen, who left behind an account of Kirkegaard's final days. As Kirkegaard's condition continued to deteriorate, hope began to slip away. Buzen asked if he would take Holy Communion, but Kirkegaard refused. He claimed that he would only take it from a layman, but not from a pastor. But this was, of course, not legal in Denmark at the time, since only ordained pastors were permitted to perform such ceremonies. So Kirkegaard declared that he would die without the communion. He rejects receiving the communion from a pastor since, he tells Buzen, quote, "The pastors are civil servants of the crown and have nothing to do with Christianity." Kirkegaard became weaker and weaker with each day, and towards the end he fell into a comatose state, not being able to recognize anyone or even to speak. Finally, he died here on the evening of November the 11th, 1855. Kirkegaard's funeral took place on Sunday, November the 18th, 1855, here in the Church of Our Lady. The situation was an awkward one, given Kirkegaard's violent attack on the church. For this reason, none of the clergy dared to show up for fear of being perceived to be sympathetic to Kirkegaard's cause. The only exceptions were Kirkegaard's elder brother, Peter Christian Kirkegaard, who was the only remaining relative in Kirkegaard's immediate family. And second, Archdeacon Egert Christopher Truthe, who was the presiding pastor. It was a difficult proposition for Truthe, since, on the one hand, he could hardly criticize Kirkegaard's attack on the church, but then, on the other hand, he could hardly ignore it completely, since it was an ongoing controversy that had attracted a great deal of public attention. Kirkegaard's brother Peter Christian took up the difficult task and gave the eulogy. He began by explaining the sad family background, recounting the life of his father and the loss of his siblings, such that only he and Soren remained. He could not avoid completely the issue of the controversy surrounding the attack on the church, although he said that the funeral was not the appropriate place to discuss it. Nonetheless, he emphasized that he thought that his brother had gone too far in his criticism, and he emphasized that much of what Soren Kirkegaard had said in the context of the articles in the Fatherland and the Moment could not be accepted. A large number of people came to Kirkegaard's funeral. Indeed, there was standing room only in the church. But it was said that there were only a few members of distinguished society present, but rather, most of the people who came were from the lower social classes. This might be taken to imply that Kirkegaard's works were popular among ordinary people who weren't trained scholars or academics. Or it might be explained by the fact that Kirkegaard was a well-known public figure who was seen regularly on his daily walks through Copenhagen. There was also doubtless an element of sensationalism involved, since people were keen to see how the official church establishment would deal with this awkward and sensitive situation. After the funeral in the church, the procession made its way here to the Essenstens Cemetery for the burial itself. Here, Kirkegaard was to be interred in the family grave where his mother, his father, and his siblings were buried. The pastor Truthe performed the simple burial ceremony, but suddenly, Kirkegaard's nephew, a young man named Henrik Lund, began to speak. Lund was a medical student who was doing his residency at the Frederiks Hospital at the time, and so he witnessed firsthand Kirkegaard's decline and death. To the surprise of absolutely everybody, he addressed the crowd at the grave in a polemical and agitated tone. The pastor Truthe tried to object that since Lund was not ordained, he had no right to speak during the ceremony. But the sentiment of the crowd of people present supported Lund, and they loudly encouraged him to speak. And so there was little that Truthe could do to prevent it. Lund began by speaking about his relation to Kirkegaard as the son of Kirkegaard's deceased sister, Nicoline Christine Kirkegaard, who had died in 1832. But Lund explained he was more than just Kirkegaard's relative. Rather, he was also his friend. Moreover, he agreed with Kirkegaard's views. Lund pointed out that at the funeral, everyone seemed to be talking around the point and carefully avoided mentioning Kirkegaard's actual opinions and writings. So he felt obligated to say something about Kirkegaard's criticism of the church in his recent articles in the Fatherland and the Moment. Lund's main argument was that the official burial and funeral of Kirkegaard by the state church was merely a vindication of the correctness of Kirkegaard's criticism. In his attack on what he derogatorily called the official church, Kirkegaard complained that being a Christian had become a simple matter of course, and thus the actual content of Christianity, which makes very difficult demands on its followers, is distorted and even destroyed. In the last years of his life, Kirkegaard had done everything he could to criticize and distance himself from this view of the official church. But yet, despite all this, the church still, nonetheless, seemed to regard him as a loyal member, and now to give him an official church burial. Lund argues that this would never happen in any other religion, such as Judaism or Islam. If someone had attacked the religious establishments of these religions in the same way that Kirkegaard had attacked the Danish church, then there would have been no question of giving him the usual funeral rites. But yet, the Danish church nonetheless still clearly regards Kirkegaard as a member and accords him the rites of burial due to its members. For Lund, this is a clear demonstration of the fact that the Danish church has no meaningful conception of Christianity, just as Kirkegaard himself had argued. Towards the end of his outburst, Lund issues a violent reproach of the Danish church. He asks, if the official church does not represent the true Christian church, what then does it represent? His answer is a merciless indictment. The Danish church is a corrupt institution that's utterly compromised by its relations to political powers, financial concerns, and so forth. He directly enjoins people to leave the official church, implying that it's sinful to continue to be a participating member of it. He ends by protesting against the entire proceedings, claiming that Kirkegaard has been violated by, in death, being the object of a formal ceremony of the official church. Since he was dead and could not defend himself, Lund, as his friend, felt obliged to do so on his behalf. But when he was done, some people applauded and shouted bravo and even down with the clergy. This was a major scandal at the time, which was recounted again and again by witnesses at the graveside to those who were not present. Some people agreed with the sentiment that informed Lund's protest, while others, especially the clergy, were outraged by it. There were newspaper articles about the outburst, and Lund himself published his speech in full 3 days later, on November the 22nd, 1855, in the Fatherland. Needless to say, the clergy and the church establishment were extremely angry about this. Bishop Martinson exercised his authority in the matter by bringing legal proceedings against Lund, which resulted in Lund being given a rather large fine for his actions. The whole affair simply added to the controversy that was already caused by Kirkegaard's own articles. As a result, in the years following Kirkegaard's death, his name was, at least here in Denmark, always associated with something scandalous and unpleasant. There can be little doubt that this had a negative effect on the initial reception of his thought, since it discouraged people from exploring his work in a scholarly fashion, since people were afraid of being associated with the scandal that he had caused. It took some time for the scandal to wear off and for a new generation to come of age, which was no longer affected by it in the same way. Thus, the reception of Kirkegaard's thought was slow to start, but once it began, it continued to grow as the years passed. I'm joined here today by Professor Daniel Conway from Texas A&M University in the United States. Professor Conway is a prolific scholar in the field of 19th century continental philosophy. He's published major works on figures such as Kirkegaard, Nietzsche, and others. Professor Conway, modern philosophy is dominated by questions such as relativism, and subjectivism, and nihilism. These questions run through the schools of, for example, existentialism or postmodernism. In your opinion, what contribution does Kirkegaard have to make to these modern discussions? Do you think he's still relevant for our modern life today?
Actually, I think Kierkegaard is probably more relevant today than he's ever been before. We're only now beginning to understand just how prescient his diagnoses and criticisms of modern life actually were. A number of his insights have been corroborated by subsequent thinkers, people like Nietzsche, Freud, Heidegger, Sartre, and Levinas. And I believe in this larger context, we can appreciate just how forward-thinking, how prescient he was.
Thinkers that you mentioned are all known for their treatments of subjectivism, relativism, and nihilism. These are the issues that dominate modern philosophy. You can see this in the schools of existentialism and postmodernism. In your mind, what contribution does Kirkegaard have to make to these modern discussions?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to point out that Kierkegaard didn't invent or introduce these particular philosophical problems. They are rightly perceived as threats to the possibility of an authentic existence, but his contribution was to diagnose them and suggest a form or a manner of treatment for them. Kierkegaard is perhaps most controversial for believing that these threats need to be kept alive and vital within us in order to connect us in an ongoing way to the fragility and finitude of the human condition. So for Kierkegaard, the goal could never be to vanquish these threats, that could only be accomplished under conditions of self-deception. The goal is rather to address these threats in a way that galvanizes our passion for an authentic existence.
So what specific aspect of Kierkegaard's writings do you find is relevant for his treatment of these issues of relativism and nihilism?
Well, I think that his interest in keeping these threats alive and vital within the psychic life of the individual, that this is most evident to us in the literary and the rhetorical complexity of his writings. He seems to be interested in mobilizing all of his literary talents in order to make sure that these threats to the possibility of an authentic existence are not allowed to submerge or to disappear from the scene. He wants to keep them front and center, and he understands just how difficult it is for most people to keep these particular threats in view.
It's my great pleasure to have with me today Professor Wang Qi from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing. Professor Wang Qi is one of the leading figures in an important translation project where they're translating Kierkegaard's writings into Chinese. Professor, why are people in China today interested in Kierkegaard? What do they see in Kierkegaard that they think is relevant for life in China?
Well, generally speaking, there are two groups of people, and one is the writers, the artists, and the lovers of literature and arts. I'll give you an example. There's one top artist, Zhang Xiaogang, and he tried to combine the so-called Kierkegaard's diaries with his own writings and photographic works. Well, it turned out his quotation of Kirkegaard from Seducer's Diary and other fragments of Either or Part 1. So these people, they don't care about the academic correctness. They just treat Kirkegaard as a creative writer and get inspiration from his writings.
Can you give us another example of how Kierkegaard is used in China today?
Philosophers, professionals, and students, and they think Kierkegaard is sort of different from the Western philosophy we know for a long time from German classic philosophy. So Kierkegaard is very crucial for us to understanding the post-Hegelian Western philosophy.
What do you see in Kierkegaard that is relevant for China today?
Well, it's quite a big question, but I will just give you a short answer. I think at least there are 2 points that are relevant to life in China today. One is, since China has already done its economic takeoff, I think it's time for the Chinese people to sit down and reflect upon their own innermost being. Since Kierkegaard is such a, he's so keen at disclosing people's innermost being and the different living mood. So he will help us definitely in that respect. Sometimes I'm really worried about my folks people, and I don't want them to be trapped or lost in commercialism. So that's one point. Another point, Well, it's referred to Kierkegaard's individualism, and actually that is the very first reason that he attracts Chinese people to read him. Because the Chinese culture has been dominated by collectivism for a long time, and it's, well, now it's time to us to think about how to become an individual who enjoys freedom and also will take responsibilities. So that's my short answer to your question. Yeah. Yes.
What can we say about Kierkegaard's legacy, or the reception of his thought by later philosophers, theologians, and writers? When historians of ideas sit down and try to tell the story of, for example, the history of philosophy, they don't really have the time to go into any great detail with respect to any individual thinker. Instead, they're obliged to paint in large strokes and to see certain continuities that allow them to treat groups of thinkers together. They thus tell the story of different schools of thought: rationalism, idealism, empiricism, materialism, and so forth. In short, it's the story of isms. But this approach invariably leads to certain distortions with respect to the nuances of the thought of the individual thinkers. There have been no shortage of attempts to see Kirkegaard as a member of a certain school of thought, or ism. The existentialists, for example, were quick to hail Kirkegaard as an important forefather of their school. They saw in Kirkegaard important analyses of concepts such as freedom, alienation, authenticity, the struggle for meaning, despair, and anxiety. These were all points of great inspiration for authors such as Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, Simone de Beauvoir, Gabriel Marcel, Karl Jaspers, Martin Heidegger, and others associated with existentialism. Philosophers and literary theorists associated with the movements of deconstruction and postmodernism have also seen Kierkegaard as an important precursor to some of their central ideas. They've been particularly attracted to Kierkegaard's interest in irony. They've seen Kierkegaard's use of the pseudonyms as a support of their views about the death of the author. They celebrate Kierkegaard's use of different perspectives and authorial voices as a forerunner of what has been referred to as the indefinite deferral of meaning. Figures such as Jacques Derrida, Gilles Deleuze, Jacques Lacan, Jean Baudrillard, and Paul de Man have been important figures in this dimension of the reception of Kierkegaard's thought. Theologians and religious writers have, of course, also been keen to make use of Kierkegaard's writings. Kierkegaard's initial reception internationally came from Germany, where he was seen as an important influence on the movement known as dialectical theology, which includes well-known figures such as Karl Barth, Emil Brunner, Paul Tillich, and Rudolf Bultmann. Although himself a Lutheran, Kierkegaard has been a source of inspiration for thinkers of various faiths and denominations, including Reformed Protestantism, Catholicism, and Judaism. Also, literary writers, including novelists, playwrights, and literary critics, have found in Kierkegaard an important source of inspiration. Writers from countries around the world have attempted to create Kierkegaardian characters or to explore in a literary way emotions such as anxiety, despair, and so forth that Kierkegaard discussed in his works. Likewise, attempts have been made to imitate and further develop Kierkegaard's own, often pioneering literary techniques. Well-known authors such as Thomas Mann, Rilke, Kafka, Ibsen, Strindberg, and Joyce have all made active use of Kierkegaard and owe a debt to him. When tracing the history of ideas, it can perhaps be useful to see the way in which Kierkegaard's writings have been appropriated by these later thinkers. But we need to be careful about automatically associating Kierkegaard with later schools of thought and intellectual trends. Kierkegaard was a profoundly original and unique figure, and his writings resist the usual designations. To see him as a member of a specific school can lead to distortions of his thought. Later thinkers tend to pick and choose certain aspects of Kierkegaard's thinking that are relevant for their own intellectual agenda. Regardless of how important these aspects are, his approach invariably leads to a selective interpretation. And so it's probably a good idea to be a bit cautious about labeling Kirkegaard in any definitive way. To be sure, to call Kirkegaard an existentialist or a postmodernist and to associate him with later thinkers also creates a new context of thought that can indeed be fruitful and useful to explore. Kierkegaard scholars today examine these later schools of thought and compare them with Kierkegaard's own writings in a critical manner. It's probably safe to say that Kierkegaard's thought can't be reduced to a single aspect or a single intellectual trend. To fully appreciate his writings requires that we look at them from different perspectives and with different interpretations. We might be tempted to say of the reception of Kierkegaard's thought what he himself said of the reception of Socrates' philosophy. Since according to Kierkegaard's interpretation, Socrates was a negative thinker in the sense that the Greek philosopher always claimed ignorance and refrained from giving any positive view in his own name, this left an open space for later interpretation to fill in. As a result, there were many different competing philosophical schools that all claimed their origin in Socrates. So also with Kirkegaard, his own Socratic mission made it such that he too was in many regards a negative thinker. This made it possible for him to be appropriated by many different schools of thought, some of which were even in conflict with one another. This negative or open-ended dimension of Kierkegaard's thought perhaps explains why he continues to appeal to so many different kinds of readers with so many different kinds of interests. We recall from the second lecture that as a young student, Kierkegaard came here to Gilleleie in the summer of 1835 to try to figure out what he wanted to do with his life. It was here that he expressed his deep desire to find a truth that had a profound meaning for him personally, as he put it, a truth for which he was willing to live and die. It seems certain that both Kierkegaard's experience here in Gilleleie and his master's thesis on Socrates and irony had a profound influence on his later development. Only about a month after Kierkegaard's death, a theologian named Hans Friedrich Helveg published an article entitled Hegelianism in Denmark. This title is, however, somewhat misleading, since Helveg only briefly mentions at the beginning some of the main works and figures in the movement of Danish Hegelianism. In fact, the large part of the article is dedicated to a book review of Kierkegaard's thesis, The Concept of Irony. The connection here is not in and of itself surprising, since, as we've seen in this course, Kierkegaard was largely inspired by Hegel and his interpretation of the Greek world and the figure of Socrates. So it makes sense that Helveg would treat the concept of irony as an important part of the Danish Hegel reception. Although modern scholarship tends to ignore the concept of irony and downplay its significance, Helveg saw the importance of this work for Kierkegaard generally. In one passage, Helveg writes, quote, "The members of the Faculty of Philosophy who were supposed to judge the work hardly suspected that in this effort of a young author they had not so much a qualification for a master's degree, but a program for life. That here it was not a matter of giving a solution to an academic problem, but of a task of life." Here Helveg emphasizes the difference between the world of academics and one's own actual existence. This reflects exactly what Kierkegaard said in Gilleleie about how he was not interested in any objective academic knowledge, but rather something that was true for him personally and something that was relevant for his life. To back up the assertion, Helveg cites a sentence at the end of The Concept of Irony, where Kierkegaard claims, "If our generation has any task at all, it must be to translate the achievement of scientific scholarship into personal life, to appropriate it personally." What does Kierkegaard mean by this? On the face of it, he seems to be making a kind of protest against academic learning just for its own sake. The point of going to the university and learning new things is not just to understand the way the world works. Instead, this knowledge should be transformed or translated into something personal. Each person must, as Kierkegaard says, appropriate that knowledge in the context of their own situation and life. So the idea of appropriation is absolutely central to Kirkegaard's understanding of the proper acquisition and use of knowledge. But now here at the end of the course, we can see that there's much more in this single sentence than what Kirkegaard could have realized at the time. As we've seen, Kirkegaard had an early academic interest, namely Socrates and his conflict with the Greek world. He made this academic interest the subject of his master's thesis. But after this was done, he took the further step that he claims here is so important. He appropriates that knowledge in accordance with his own modern situation. He was attracted to many aspects of Socrates' thought and decided to use him as a model. But the world of ancient Greece in which Socrates lived was of course very different from Kierkegaard's Golden Age Denmark. So Kierkegaard needed to appropriate the main elements from the thought of Socrates and transfer them into his own time. So the key terms of the thought of Socrates, such as irony, ignorance, negation, aporia, maieudics, and the gadfly, and so on, all came to take on a new meaning in the context of Kierkegaard's own life and time. Helvig was entirely right. Socrates was for Kierkegaard not just an object of scholarly investigation, but also a model to follow for his personal life. But there's another aspect of Helvig's observation. Kierkegaard was familiar with the scholarly field of theology, which he learned about at the University of Copenhagen. Again, as we've seen in the Gillelei entry in his journal, Kierkegaard is only interested to a certain degree in theology as an academic discipline. Instead, he believes that Christianity is not a doctrine or an objective truth that can be taught in books or in the classroom. Instead, Christianity is a belief that must be appropriated by each individual personally in inwardness and passion. Christianity is all about the subjectivity of each individual. There are no easy answers, since each person is obliged to appropriate the Christian message in one's own life and context. So no one can tell another person how this should be done. So Kierkegaard believes that Socrates can help us in the modern world. With his irony and negativity, he can help us to undermine mistaken views and modern illusions that people still suffer from. With his idea of maieudics or midwifery, he can help us to understand that each and every one of us individually has the truth within ourselves. Each and every human being has an infinite value that should be respected. These are important messages for us living in the 21st century, regardless of whether we think of ourselves as religious or not. We struggle to understand our role in the fast-moving, anonymous society around us. What is my importance? What is the meaning and value of my life? Do I really count for anything as a person, or am I simply a number or a statistic? Kierkegaard is not just a figure locked into his own time, who with every passing day becomes less and less relevant, only to end up an object of interest for a handful of specialists in the history of ideas. On the contrary, I believe that every day as society continues to develop and new technological innovations change our way of living, interacting, and thinking about ourselves, Kierkegaard becomes more and more relevant. He might have died in 1855, but he's still very much with us today, especially for those like you who have the ability to read his works and appreciate his ideas.